This is something that I really want to talk about to be sure that everyone is cautious and stays level-headed at all times. For context, I live in the middle of nowhere in Canada. It was an old town that had quite a few abandoned buildings due to absence of residents. Me and my friends, we were tired of the lack of entertainment options for us, so what we did was explore these abandoned buildings. Prior to the experience that I'm about to talk about, we never had anything too crazy happen to us. I mean, occasionally we'd see a small bit of blood like liquid, and we'd see pentagrams on the ground from time to time from someone who went to a house previously, but nothing too bad. That is, until the last time that I'd gone exploring abandoned buildings. Now, when I was younger, I used to go to a daycare that was part of a mental hospital. A weird combination, I know, but it was closed down due to a lack of patients and lack of children at the daycare. I decided to go back there with my friends a few years ago. I was 15 when this happened, and most of my friends were the same age. When we got there, it was rather cliche, I guess. There was fog, it was rather dark, and there was a light drizzle of rain too. We went to the main gate, which was padlocked shut. We decided to help each other hop over it, and we made a ton of noise. We were laughing and giggling the whole time, unsuspecting of what was about to happen. We looked around the small place park with flashlights that we had on our person. Even with our somewhat powerful flashlights, our visibility was rather limited, but we decided to enter the decaying building. Glass and dirt crunched under our feet as we stepped into the daycare section of the complex. There were still old Legos, wood chips from previous furniture, old torn dolls and toys strewn about. But the further that we walked around the daycare section, we naturally became more and more silent, until all we could hear was the crunch of dirt under our feet. I found some crayons in a plastic container in the corner of the room. I walked over to pick them up, when all of a sudden we heard a loud crash coming from behind a metal door leading to the psych ward part of the building. My friends and I sort of all looked at each other. As a whole, we were a group of 5. Most of them were bold and cocky, but we all looked at each other when my friend Brian suggested that we go and look to see where the sound came from. Personally, I was not too fond of the idea, but there was no way anyone was going to decline such a thing. We all stacked up on the door and opened it. It was rusted to the floor, and we sort of heaved to get it open. As we walked in, the metallic smells and must became really strong. But there was a hint of something else which I just couldn't put my finger on at that moment. We walked in with our flashlights pointed in every direction, with Brian leading the group. The hallways were tight, and to the left and the right were the occasional metal doorway, some of the doors open. I felt slightly claustrophobic too, and it felt a little hard to breathe at some points. As we continued, Brian shone his flashlight into a room and suddenly recoiled. We all stopped walking as Brian slowly entered the room. "What is it?" I asked. "I thought I saw someone here. It seems all fine now, though." To be honest, I thought that he was just messing with us to increase our anxiety. But looking back, I think that he was completely honest. He backed out of the room, and we continued walking deeper into the psych ward, when another friend swiftly told us to stop. We came to a halt and all listened. In the distance, ahead of us, we heard the subtle pitter-patter of footsteps echo through the hallway. We all looked at each other, fear in each of our eyes. Brian continued walking toward the sounds. We considered turning back for a second without Brian, wondering if some ghost or something or someone was in the building. But we couldn't do that to him, and the closer that we got, the more that I felt like I was being watched. When, finally, we entered a room on the right which had the smell of what I can only describe as just rotting meat. And in front of us was a dead deer. Its innards were spilled all over the floor, staining the concrete. A friend of mine had a very weak stomach and vomited all over the floor. And that's when we heard whispers from somewhere. Brian quickly shot around and shone his flashlight to the corner of the room, where there was a man with short hair standing with his head down. He had a bright green t-shirt stained with what I assumed was blood, and torn beige pants. He didn't have any socks, and his feet seemed sort of damaged. He was sort of twitching sporadically too, and continued to mumble, even after we saw him. We stared at him for a solid 30 seconds before he made his first true movement. He looked up at us with what I will never forget, a haunting grin that just sent shivers immediately down my spine. And he said, "You guys here for the feast?" This kicked us over the edge, and we immediately bolted out of that room all the way back down to the daycare center. The door, thank God, was still open, and we decided to try and slam it shut behind us, but the rust and the pure weight of the door almost kept it open. It took 3 of us pulling with all of our might to close it, but we eventually got it there. And just before we did, I could still see the silhouette of the man watching us, his white teeth being the only other human feature that I could see in the dark from that distance. As we sat behind the metal door catching our breath for a second, all looking at each other for confirmation that we all just saw the same thing, after a little bit of labored breathing from each of us, we heard a light tapping on the door. It was at that point that we decided it was well and truly time to leave. We booked it out of the vicinity completely, and we pretty much just ran the whole way home. Police went back to do a routine search of the area, and they actually found the man. It was stated that this guy used to go to the psych ward before it was closed down. He escaped the facility he was transferred to and lived off of the wildlife around the complex. When the cops brought him in, he had a series of diseases and sicknesses from eating raw meat, apparently, and his mental condition was much worse than before. There were rumors that he did kill someone in the forest while searching for food, but nothing has ever been confirmed. But apparently people have gone missing there or something. But anyway, in the end, guys, just be careful, especially in dangerous areas such as abandoned buildings. Be smarter than we were, especially in dangerous areas such as abandoned buildings. A few years ago, my husband and I were staying in Brighton in the UK for a few nights. It was a short getaway before I started a new job. I'll have to ask him the name of the hotel as I can't remember, but I do remember that it was an older building. The inside was pretty modern though, and the whole place was a bit like a maze, up and down stairs, through doorways, around corners, through archways, etc. Our room though was set up like any standard hotel room. Bathroom situated immediately to the right as you enter the room, bed against one wall, and a dresser with a TV on it on the opposite. It seemed like a relatively nice room for the price though, at least by my low standards I suppose. We were out for the whole first day though after we arrived, got back to the room at around 10:30ish, and started to settle down for the evening. I sat on the bed for a while, scrolling on my phone while my husband was laying on his side of the bed with all the pillows stacked up behind him, so he was nearly sitting up, facing the TV dresser setup sort of thing, and at this point, the whole room was being lit up by one lamp that my husband had turned on the side of his bed. I stood up next to my side of the bed and started to change into my pajamas. As I had my nightshirt pulled over my head, arms not even through the armholes yet, something made me pause. Suspended over the dresser, in the empty space about maybe a foot from the TV, was a brilliantly bright white-blue ball of light, roughly the size of a football. My mind was racing to make sense of what I was seeing. At first I thought it must be some weird reflection in the picture on the wall behind it or something, but that just didn't make sense. I mean, the object was clearly 3D, not a reflection. My second thought was that maybe I'd had a brain aneurysm and was dying. It happens to 20-something-year-olds all the time. But within milliseconds, the light began to expand. It didn't just light up the room, too. It literally grew in size until it completely engulfed the whole room. My third thought was that this must be some type of nuclear warfare, something radioactive, but it didn't make any sense that it was completely silent. It didn't put off any heat either. It didn't hurt at all. But in an instant, it was gone. The room that was lit up by one lamp now seemed dark in comparison. For a few seconds afterward, I couldn't really see anything as my eyes were adjusting back to the one lamp's worth of light in the room again. In my head, that was a psychological sign too that I hadn't imagined this light. But with my shirt still halfway on, I looked over at my very skeptical husband who said, "What the heck was that?" At first I thought that it might have been a camera flash, but that just didn't make any sense. I've never seen a camera flash so brilliant. And that's not exactly the stealthy camera that you'd want to hide in a hotel room to spy on guests or anything. We thought that it might have been something electrical, but the TV worked fine. None of the light bulbs blew. Our phones that were all plugged in during this were fine. It just didn't make any sense. The one thing that I couldn't, and still can't get over though, is how the light was literally floating in the middle of the air, and the fact that it was such a perfect circle. Anyway, I've only ever told this story to a few people, but no one really knows what to say other than commenting on how odd the story is. Has anyone else experienced a big glowing ball of light in their hotel room before? If so, please let me know, and if you have any idea about what this could have been, then I would love to hear from you. This encounter would have happened a little over 10 years ago now, I would guess. I would have been 26, 27 at the time. I'm male, but I cannot 100% remember what year it was now. I think it was sometime from 2011 to 2013. At the time, though, I was frequently going out with my friends to bars and parties and just hanging out until pretty late most weekends. The friend's house that I usually hung out at was on a side street, just off of a main road where a lot of popular and crowded bars and restaurants were. You had to park on the street at his house, and during the weekend when it was busy, it was pretty common to have to park a number of blocks away. But the street closer to the bars was pretty nice. If you went a few blocks in the opposite direction, it got a little sketchier at night though. Anyway, after hanging out one particular night, I had to walk back to my car pretty late, which was parked a number of blocks away towards the slightly sketchier area. This was during the winter, so I was wearing some kind of heavy sweater or pullover and a beanie or knit hat. This detail is only important as you couldn't really gather much idea about what I looked like from a distance in the dark, aside from my general height and build, I guess. There wasn't much through traffic though as you got further away from the bars, and the roads were pretty dark without any streetlights too. As I was walking down the sidewalk, a car started slowly creeping down the street, matching my pace as it pulled up beside me and then stopped. The window of the car rolled down, and driving the car was an attractive young woman who said that I looked cold and that I should let her give me a ride to where I was going. She seemed friendly enough. I indicated that I wasn't parked far away and appreciated the offer, but was going to just keep walking anyways. She then tried really hard to convince me to get into the car with her, since it was so cold. No small talk to establish any information about me, mind you, to make sure that I wasn't a weirdo, just asking me to get into the car pretty aggressively. Based on what I was wearing and how dark it was, there was no way that she could really have had much idea about what I actually looked like to possibly find me attractive. And even if she did, I didn't know many women who would pick up a male stranger after midnight when they're alone in the car like that. There were about 10 cars nearby she could have gone to if she just wanted to pick up a guy. There was no reason that I could think of that she would have to resort to driving around offering to pick up strangers. She continued to drive alongside me though and offered me a ride again, which I declined and just kept going. I picked up my pace and she eventually drove off. But as soon as she was a few blocks away, I quickly got to my car and made sure that there was nobody lurking around or close by. But I don't know, the whole scenario just felt so off and didn't make sense to me. I asked my friends about it later and all of the women agreed. They wouldn't offer a random guy a ride at nighttime. In that kind of scenario, even if the guy did look like Ryan Gosling. My suspicion? is that there was someone laid back in the back seat or something of the car out of view with a weapon, waiting to rob anyone who accepted the ride. I couldn't really figure out any reason that she would be offering rides like that to complete strangers in the middle of the night, as it would be very unsafe for her to just pick up random strangers like that. I just assumed that there had to be something nefarious going on in that car, and I do wonder what would have happened if anyone would have just hopped in there with her. This story happened to me back when I still lived at my parents' house. I was commuting to college at the time and had 3 siblings that also lived at home, my brother and 2 sisters. For some context, we lived on 5 acres in rural Ohio, surrounded on both sides by woods and farm fields. Additionally, during the week, my dad normally left for work at like 2 in the morning, so I had always felt like it was my job to be the man of the house, because he was gone during the times when you would imagine something sketchy happening. However, on this night, because it was the weekend, my dad was home. I woke up to the sound of my brother's voice trying to get my attention. We had separate rooms upstairs, and coming out of our rooms, you would sort of look down over the banister to see our front door. When I woke up, it took me a few moments to get out of the haze and realize what was going on. I looked at the clock, and it was around 2:30 in the morning, and my brother told me that there were 2 men at our front door. Of course, now, this is a real wake-up call, obviously, so I was pretty much awake now. But we quietly walk out of my room and peek over to look down at the front door. When we looked, there was no one at the door, but I noticed my parents off to the side, out of view of the glass on the front door. I whispered down to my dad, and he told me that there were 2 guys who had been talking to each other and knocking on the door. Hearing my dad say this freaked me out even more. I went back into my room and grabbed my pistol, quickly shuffling down the stairs after looking to make sure that they weren't at the door anymore. If they had been, they would have easily seen me coming down the stairs, as it is in direct view of the door. My brother is right behind me as we sort of head over to where my parents are, whispering to try and find out what was going on. My parents had woken up to our dog barking apparently and come out to see these 2 men knocking loudly at the door. At this point, we see the men return and they begin knocking again, despite the fact that nobody had come to the door and our dog is still actively barking. The fact that they were there at this time, in a location where houses are spread out hundreds of yards, and still knocking while the dog was barking, made the situation even more terrifying. After a couple of minutes, the men walk away and we all shuffle across the kitchen into the family room to peek out of the windows into our driveway, which is lit up by our outside light. There was a black Cadillac sitting there, but nobody inside from what we could see. Immediately the question was, where did those guys go? They weren't in their car and they were no longer at the front door. Unfortunately, we figured out the answer when the handles on our back French doors started jiggling. They were actively trying to enter the back of our house, which enters into the kitchen. At this point, I just remember my mum frantically saying David, as pure terror overwhelmed her. 2 things happened as well. Adrenaline filled my body as I prepared my handgun, horrified at the very real possibility that I might actually have to shoot these men. Secondly, my dad finally grabbed the phone, called the police, and calmly told them what was happening. Thankfully, after a minute of jiggling, they stopped at the back door and disappeared again, only to return to their knocking at the front door. However, at this point, several minutes had gone by, and suddenly we saw the local police fly up in multiple cruisers with their lights on. As they whipped into our driveway and front yard, the 2 men bolted away, attempting to run the long way around the house across the driveway. One of them disappeared out of view, but the other one was intercepted by an officer yelling for him to get on the ground. He didn't, and he was immediately tased and fell on the ground. Some of the officers went around the house after the other guy, and one of them came to talk to my dad as we came out of the front. They ended up finding the other man hiding in my sister's little playhouse in the backyard, and it appears that both of them were drunk or high or something, as one of them had actually hid cocaine on himself, and while they were both arrested that night, We actually never did find out what they were charged with or what happened to them in the end. Needless to say, the whole experience was not fun, and it's definitely something that I do not want to go through ever again. So, I, a 26-year-old male, have had what I believe is either two paranormal experiences or maybe my mind is playing tricks on me. When I was in year 10, around 15 years of age, around 2011-ish, I was staying up late on a Saturday night. I was chilling in the lounge watching Comedy Central on TV under a blanket. It was winter in New Zealand. Around midnight, as I was watching TV, I saw what resembled a young boy with a bowl-styled haircut, and what I can assume is eyeless sockets just pop out by the front door, which was maybe 10 feet from where I was sitting. I won't deny that my heart was wearing its brown pants that night. I slowly got up, wrapped my duvet around like it was going to protect me. Then this little person disappeared in front of my eyes. I proceeded to basically put the light switch through the wall as I turned the lounge light on for protection. I slowly peeked around the corner to see if he was still there, but no, he was gone. I'm not sure why I slowly searched the house looking for him as my family slept, but in the end I found nothing. The next day, as I was in the lounge with my family, I saw in the corner of my eye at the end of the hallway that same little boy go from what was our wash house walk into what was our cupboards. Yes, like a full-body apparition. I told my mother, who was sitting next to me, about it, but she told me that she saw him a few days prior and had invited him into the lounge at one point, apparently. And well, we moved shortly, a few months after that. The second experience, though, was around COVID. My family and I had to move from a house that we lived in for nearly 10 years because the landlords were selling it. Again, I was watching TV late at night and I decided to go to bed at around 1 in the morning, so I walked to where my room was at the end of the house in total darkness. I knew the layout of the house like the back of my hand. And as I turned, I go into my room. I bumped into something. I suddenly looked in front of me and there was what I can only describe as a shadow of a person that was kind of, well, darkness that was blacker than the blackness of the night. The odd thing, though, about this shadow was that it was taller than I am. For context, I'm 6'2", and I weighed about 90 kilos. And this shadow was huge. It wasn't like I was mistaking it for something either. I, for some reason, just apologized for bumping into it. And I said, "Sorry, mate," not thinking that maybe this shadow person could have been a person who entered the house unlawfully or something, but after said realization, my heart put on its brown pants again. I wasn't as brave to go looking for said shadow person on this encounter, and I proceeded to hide in my bed under the covers like the big coward that I am. So for this, I'm going to refer to my friends as bridemaid of honor and niece because this was a bachelorette trip. It will be a year in March when my friends and I went to Chattanooga, TN, to celebrate my childhood best friend's marriage. It was a beautiful house on the Tennessee River, very private and peaceful atmosphere. It was on a nature trail, so it felt very isolated, though it was close enough to the city for us to go out and have some fun too. Anyway, we all had a great time in the city, then came back and started a fire in the fire pit. We hung out until we got tired and eventually we went to bed. We all decided to bunk in the same room that had 3 double bunks and 1 full bed. It was a large room and we thought that we could all watch a movie together in there, but ended up all deciding that we needed sleep to drive back the next day. As my friends are used to falling asleep early, I'm not, so I was still wide awake as they were sleeping. I got my phone and I started scrolling. I know it's a bad habit, but I had really no other options of reading a book or anything. As I'm laying there, I just get this feeling all of a sudden, and it's not a good one. I have had one paranormal experience before this, and it didn't make me feel scared. I just felt a bit confused, I guess, but this was different. I felt my hair stand up, like that feeling of something with ill intent was near me. I look up at the other bunks, my friends look fine, so I continue scrolling, and then I get the feeling again, and I look up, and this time I look towards the full-size bed, where the bride and her little niece who tagged along were, and I see a dark figure, head bent down, looking down at the niece. And my heart stopped. I couldn't move. I kept thinking to myself that it's just a shadow from the stairway light coming in the room, surely. I look down at my phone, and eventually I get the courage to move my thumbs to text my boyfriend how scared I was, which didn't help considering that he's not a believer in anything of that nature, so he just says that you're just seeing things. But after this, I look up and the figure is gone, which didn't make me feel any better, only worse, because it only confirmed that what I saw was in fact a shadow from something and not a light in the stairway or anything. So I jumped up from my bunk and bolted up the stairs and crashed on the couch, and I just felt like a small kid who just watched a horror movie. I also kept hearing what sounded like creaking from the stairs. I thought of the old phrase, "It's just the house settling," to try and calm myself. Then I called my boyfriend, and he talked me down, and I thought that he was probably right, but I was still shaken up. Eventually I fell asleep at around 4 in the morning, when the creaking stopped, but woke up at around 6, and I got the courage to go downstairs to get into my bag for clothes, and a few minutes after, the maid of honor comes up, and she looks confused and kind of freaked out, and then says, "Hey, did the bride come up here at all?" I said, "When?" Because I only slept 2 hours and I've been up since like 6 o'clock. She then says, "Well, I mean, about that time, I could have sworn that I saw her up and go up the stairs." I said, "No, I don't think she came up here." She says, "Well, I know I saw someone go up the stairs." Her face was white with fear, and I said, "Did you check the bed?" She then goes back down and looks and says in confusion, "She's in bed." And so I just stood in confusion and said, "Well, what time did you say you saw her again?" And she said that, "Well, only a couple of minutes ago. It's just 6:05. And I said, "Maybe you just heard me. I mean, I've been up here since last night." And she goes, "Well, I thought that I saw someone standing between their suitcases and the bed over her niece." That was when my heart dropped, and she knew that I hadn't been there, and I didn't have to say anything at all. My face said it. She knew that I saw it too, and needless to say, we were happy to get out and not investigate. I did feel guilty that I didn't stay downstairs with them to make sure that they were okay after she confirmed what I saw. However, I was convinced that it was just my anxiety, and my boyfriend being very skeptical made me think maybe I was just reacting, but the look on my friend's face of pure confusion and fear, it confirmed it for me. I don't know if it's related, but a few months later, I learned one of the supposed most haunted places in Tennessee, Hale's Bar, is located just 2 miles on the river from this location. Also, there was this really old cabin from the 1800s, and they had decorated it for looks on the property, and it definitely had some weird vibes to it. It didn't help, too, that they had these old pictures inside of it of the owners. I wish I'd remembered the names so I could see if they had any correlation to the Hales Bar Marina or something, but in any case, I won't be going back there anytime soon, that's for sure. When I was in high school, I took a glass-blowing course at a remote craft school called Snow Farm. It was located on the foothills of the Berkshire Mountains. It was a 2-week course, and our instructor was this guy in his early to mid-40s, who was really nice and actually quite ripped as well, but also very friendly. He wore glasses and a tank top to class every day, which revealed these thick scars on the back of his neck and shoulder, as well as a fully tattooed back. The most interesting thing about his appearance, however, was this sort of I don't know, like supervillain-esque scar running from the top of his forehead, down across his right eye, and ending at the bottom of his cheek. As the class got more friendly with him, a few fellow classmates and I asked him what his back piece looked like. He took off his shirt and revealed a vibrantly colourful tattoo of a dragon holding a box cutter. When we asked him about the significance of the box cutter, he told us an incredible story that I honestly wouldn't have believed had he not had the scars to prove it. He began by telling us that he was an amateur boxer for many years and was quite familiar with fighting. One day he was approached by a crackhead that started screaming at him and trying to fight. The crackhead was apparently trying to rob him. Our instructor at the time punched the crackhead and knocked him unconscious. He explained to us, though, that when someone is under the influence of crack cocaine, meth, or other intense stimulants, they develop almost superhuman abilities. I have heard stories like this since that corroborate this, and after knocking him out, he got right back up and kept at it. He knocked him out a third time, and this time, the crackhead pulled out a box cutter and started slashing at our instructor's face, arms, and back. I'm not sure if the crackhead first attacked him from behind, or maybe as he was walking away or something, because the scars on his back of his neck made it seem like he was slashed by surprise, but he knocked the crackhead out again, this time grabbing the box cutter and stabbing him over and over in the chest with it. He took off his shirt and tied it around his head to prevent the bleeding, and he told us that every time his heart would beat, blood would spurt out from his head, and he then hopped on his bike and rode 20 minutes to the nearest hospital. This story truly sounds like it's out of a movie, but our instructor later explained to me privately that he too was smoking and selling crack at the time. The fight was the result of a crackhead trying to steal his crack apparently, and I asked him if he thinks that he killed the guy, and he said that he had no idea because he left immediately afterward. I got to thinking about how deep of a blade one would need to pierce internal organs. I'm not really sure, but regardless, I thought that it was the most valid story behind a tattoo that I'd ever heard. He's been clean for years, and he even has a wife and kids now apparently, and him and his wife are quite successful in the glass-blowing or metalworking industry. So, to protect my client, I'll be calling her Mrs. Spooky because I'm too lazy to come up with a better name. But I, a 21-year-old female, started this job, being an at-home healthcare worker, back in September. The job at first was your pretty average job. All I basically had to do was to make sure my client was well taken care for and make sure that she had someone to talk to. Everything was very normal, up until I started picking up more shifts at night. I'm a college student. And one morning, I was getting my client's medication ready when her grandson, who lives with her, is about to walk out to go to work. Because he kept knocking over this can of Febreze, he then put the can of Febreze in between the couch cushions so it couldn't move. 10 minutes after he leaves, the can of Febreze jumps out of the couch cushions, does a flip, and lands straight upwards. I freak out for a second, but then I play it off and tell myself that there's a reasonable explanation. But it keeps continuing. Frames falling off of walls, people talking in the kitchen and hallway when nobody is home but me and my client, things being thrown at me even, the figure of a face smeared against the kitchen window, and even shadow people at times. But last night was definitely the worst of it. You see, I got there early yesterday because my client had a food package waiting to be put in the fridge. My client greets me with a smile, and I make her some mac and cheese after I put the food up. My client dropped her fork and asked me to wash it, so I did. While cleaning off the fork, I hear a can fall behind me, so I go to pick it up, and the scrub brush from the sink goes flying at me. Obviously, I'm spooked by that, but it's not the first time that this has happened, so I go back to hanging out with Mrs. Spooky. Things are pretty back to normal until I hear more things start to fall in the kitchen. I think to myself, maybe a cat snuck in again. So I go and turn on the kitchen light, but the light bulb bursts, and the house goes from a good 94, my client gets cold easy, to a cool 60-ish degrees. At this point, I'm hoping that there was just a weird power surge that has just turned everything off. But I rush back to my client. Everything is fine. No power outages, and it's still pretty hot in the living room. But then a shadow moves in the kitchen, and this time my client jumps back. Luckily, her grandson pulled up right after this, and even he was pretty spooked when I told him what had just happened. But that was one of the first times that I've ever seen her react like that, and that to me gave me confirmation that I'm not going crazy and that there's something in here. Maybe it's a ghost or a demon, or maybe someone has been in the house without anyone knowing it. All I know is that I'm absolutely terrified of going back to work there, and I really don't know what to do. When I was a kid, my mum and I lived with my grandparents in their 3-story house. It had a basement, a ground floor, and a second floor. And to give some context, there was a living room directly in front of the stairs, leading upstairs so that you could see my mum's room on the left, which is important for later, and my grandparents' room on the right. My room was further down the 2nd-story hall, but I spent a lot of time alone and with my uncle in the basement. For more context too, the basement was a huge rectangle with one room directly to the left of the stairs, my uncle's room, and one room in the far back left corner, storage room, also important for later. And so, with the context out of the way, here's the actual story. So this all happened when I was 8 or 9. I can't remember exactly, but it was around when Halo 3 came out. The first time it happened, it was honestly the worst. I was homesick from school. In reality, I just wanted to play Halo, but everyone in the house worked, so I was alone and my uncle was at school. The only Xbox in the house was in the basement, so naturally, when everybody left, I got up and went to go and play Halo. I'm down there for a few hours, playing games happily, and all of a sudden, the storage room that I mentioned earlier creaks open ever so slightly. Not completely, but just enough to see a slit of darkness, and plain as day, I hear my mum call me from what sounded like the furthest corner of the storage room, saying that she needed help putting something away. My mum wasn't home at the time, and I knew this, but I didn't turn anything off, and I just bolted upstairs and laid on the couch until my uncle got home from school. He asked why I left the Xbox on, and he thought that I was sick and laughed at me, and I just laughed back and said, "My bad, won't happen again." The only other time this happened was actually during a family dinner that we had cousins and pretty much our entire family over for a holiday. My cousins and I were playing with Nerf guns in the living room, and they got hungry at one point and went to get some more food, so I sat by myself in the living room reloading my magazines with darts when something caught my eye upstairs. Same year as the last encounter, mind you. I'm still 8 or 9 in this scenario. It was my mum's room door, and it had opened, and because it was like 8 p.m, it was dark upstairs, and because no one was up there, so there were no lights on, but my mum had walked out from the darkness and kind of waved me over to her with a weird smile on her face. I yelled to her, "Why?" and she just kept waving me over, not saying a word. But I clearly saw my mum, so I didn't question her again and started walking over, but as I got to the start of the stairs, I looked to my right and I saw my mum talking with my aunt at the dinner table. So I walked over there and asked her what she wanted and if she'd been upstairs, and she said no. I immediately went back to the living room, looked up the stairs, and her door was closed again. Nothing like that ever happened again after that, but it still gives me the chills when I think about it. When I was a kid, my little sister and I were visiting my dad, my older brother and sister that lived with him, his new wife and her kids, 2 girls and a boy, in a small country town in southern Western Australia called Manjimup. There was only 3 bedrooms in the house, 2 at the front of the house and 1 at the back. My dad and his wife were in one of the front rooms, and my brother and stepbrother were in the other, which left the last room at the very back of the house away from the others for us 5 girls. This first night that we were there, it was a very hot summer's night and the house didn't have any air conditioning, so being too hot to sleep, we were just sitting in our beds just talking and catching up since it had been a few months since we had seen each other. We had opened the bedroom window to catch the small breeze that was blowing, in the hopes of cooling the room down a little bit so that we could eventually sleep somewhat comfortably. We were all chatting away and giggling around 1 a.m, and the rest of the household seemed to be sound asleep when suddenly my big sister Sandy told us to all be quiet and listen. When we did, we all heard what I can only describe as a very loud rubber band being snapped over and over again. It sounded like it was on like a loudspeaker as well. And what was even weirder was all the other night sounds that had stopped and the breeze was gone too. It was so still, apart from this rubber band noise. We started whispering to each other about what it could be, but really couldn't explain it. Sandy decided that we should go outside and see if we could see what it was, since it sounded so close. Stupid kids, I know, but we all agreed and we headed out into the backyard. Once there, the sound seemed to get louder for just a minute, then it started to fade away or even kind of move towards the front of the house. The backyard joined to the driveway without any fence or gate, so without saying anything to each other, we all kind of just started following the sound down the driveway. I honestly don't know why. I think we were all just very curious. Once we were out the front of the house, the sound suddenly stopped, and it was suddenly eerily still for just a second. And then a baby started crying somewhere out past the front yard on the other side of the road, which was bushland. At least when we talked about it later, this is where we agreed that it sounded like it was coming from. Again, we followed, but when we got into the middle of the road, it started sounding like it was coming from sort of all around us. My little sisters wanted to go back inside at this point, but Sandy was worried that one of our neighbor's toddlers had got out onto the road somehow. I don't know why this made sense to us, but we started walking up and down the road a few 100 meters each way, looking for any baby or toddler in the drainage ditches on the other side of the road, or the edge of the bush, but we just never seemed to get any closer or further away from the crying. After a few minutes, the crying just stopped, and again there was silence. We all stopped in our tracks and just looked at each other. I was holding my breath, but after a couple of seconds, all the normal night sounds and the breeze just started again like nothing had happened. Suddenly, though, we were all absolutely terrified and ran home as fast as we could, not stopping until we were back in bed and my sister Sandy had slammed the window closed too. After a little bit, we were able to kind of shake off what had just happened and go back to talking, but we never turned off the light or opened the window again that night. We also didn't get much sleep too. For the rest of our visit, we never opened that window at night, no matter how hot it was, which made our dad finally go buy a fan for the room, and we also brought in a lamp that we kept on all night just to make us feel a little bit better. My dad, stepmom, and brothers never woke up and never heard anything like what we did. None of the neighbors' kids had got out or were missing, so they kind of dismissed what we had said happened apart from telling us off for leaving the house at night. I think they thought that we had just scared ourselves telling spooky stories or something. We never heard either noise again, mind you, and my dad moved the family to another house about 6 months later, so we eventually stopped talking about it. This happened when I was about 12 or 13. I'm 43 now, and to this day I still have no idea what the original sound was from, why we felt like we needed to follow it, or if the baby crying was even related to it. But when I think about it, I still get freaked out. I mean, I just can't help but think that something was trying to lure us out of the house, and if so, why didn't anything happen when we did go outside? If anyone has any ideas on how to explain my experience, or even just what the rubber band noise might have been, then I would love to know, and please do share. So, a few strange things have occurred to me and my boyfriend since we moved into our current flat last July, and I just feel like this would be the best place to share it and just get it off my chest. It might be a little bit long too, so I apologize in advance, but I was just looking for maybe some answers or some sort of advice. Now, before I describe these events, I'll say that I began experiencing sleep paralysis around 4 years ago and have had a range of unpleasant experiences with it in the past. However, these experiences have never been physical, only visual. That is, until moving into this new flat. I'll also say that my boyfriend has never had any past experiences regarding anything that he would consider paranormal, though the events that have occurred in the flat have left us both a bit confused and definitely a little bit spooked out too. Since my boyfriend and I moved into our flat, we've experienced minor things such as noises sounding like something has fallen onto the floor and begun to roll across it, only to find nothing that could have made the noise. Other times we have heard noises as if someone large or something large is being dragged across the wall in the hallway, but when we've opened our door to check what was making all that noise, there's nothing there, and the motion sensor light is off too. If it's activated, it stays lit for around 5 minutes. One more common thing too we experience is the chain on the bedroom blinds rocks from side to side sometimes. This doesn't happen as a gentle swaying though. There have been a number of occasions where we have gone into the bedroom to investigate a loud clattering noise. We've heard it over the volume of our TV and music even, to find it swinging violently from left to right, rather than forwards and backwards. We've tried to explain this away as just a draft, but this would continue to happen even when there was no possible airflow from the windows, vents, fans, or the radiator. And even if this were to be caused by any of these things, the chain would swing forwards and backwards, not left and right, and it definitely would not make such a noise to begin with. It sounds as if it's being lifted up and released, causing it to hit the wall and then begin to sway. Anyway, upon initially moving in, I was having some trouble sleeping, or staying asleep I should say, to the point where I had to seek some medical advice. I was sleeping during the day as I work part-time night shift while I'm at university and finishing work at 7:30 in the morning, but have since just started going to bed earlier in the evening. When I was actually managing to sleep, I would have very graphic, intense nightmares. Some were so bad that I would wake up and just burst into tears even. On a few occasions, I would have sleep paralysis too, but there was one time that this happened that ended up really shaking me up. Across from my bed, there's a wardrobe where both doors are fully mirrored. The right side wall, as you see it from the bed, also has a mirror above a small desk. During this particular sleep paralysis, I watched my boyfriend, who was not home but at work, walk past the wardrobe mirrors from left to right, but this appeared only as his reflection inside the mirror. He then wasn't visible for a moment as he seemed to have walked out of frame of the mirror, until I saw the reflection walk past the other mirror on the right. After this, there was nothing for a few seconds, but I was still in paralysis, until I felt something yank the bottom of my duvet covers away from me. Cliché, I know, but this had never happened to me before. It spooked me out of my sleep paralysis, and I shot up and grabbed my covers towards me, because they had actually moved. I still don't know how to explain this away, as my sleep paralysis experiences have never been physical like this before, so I don't really know what to make of it. But another similar instance happened one night that my boyfriend was driving home from work and got stuck in a bad traffic jam on the motorway, delaying him a good few hours due to the distance from the site that he had been working at. But because I was working early, I went to bed before he arrived home, and at some point in the evening I remember him getting home and me having a sleepy conversation with him right before he got into bed, and I fell back asleep. I'm not sure how long after this, but I was woken up again, but I was woken up by my boyfriend, who was standing at the side of the bed and had brought us some food. I was instantly confused, asking where he had got the food from and when he had left to go and get it, to be met with the same confusion, because apparently he had only just gotten home. I'm still so confused by this, as this is not something that has ever happened to me and really creeped us both out, and I just don't know what to make of it. But the final straw for me was one evening I was talking to my boyfriend as I was just walking around tidying up, only to turn to him at one point and see what I can only describe as a solid silhouette of a child crouched down directly behind him. At this point, I started straight up freaking out, running into the bedroom and refusing to leave for the rest of the night. The first day that I contacted my stepmom, who is very spiritual and has had all sorts of encounters and experiences with the unseen world, including running her own business where she does Reiki and tarot cards or something, amongst other things. My dad and my stepmom came to visit the following weekend, where she cleansed the flat and recommended that I buy a black tourmaline for protection, which I have. But since then, this kind of activity has decreased but not stopped entirely, resigning itself to just the random, unexplained noises, I guess. But one thing that I noted when my stepmom came to cleanse the flat was that she had asked whose side of the bed it was that my boyfriend slept on, but didn't elaborate why she asked that, and honestly, I didn't ask why at that time, but I'm going to, as the events keep playing on in my mind, and I feel like I have no answers to anything. I really don't know what to make of any of this, to be honest. The only connections that I can make are all leading back to my boyfriend, with the silhouette crouched behind him, the physical sleep paralysis, him getting home twice in the same night, and my stepmom asking about his side of the bed. But this is the second place that we've lived together, and the occurrence has only started upon moving here. I did scour the depths of the internet and found that supposedly we live right by a ley line, but I've found no solid evidence to support this, though it is apparently discussed in a book about the city that was published in 1987, which talks about legends, folklore, and mysteries. This particular book, however, seems pretty hard to come across, with it either being unavailable or unaffordable. But in any case, does anyone have any suggestions or ideas that I could investigate into a little bit? Because, as for now, I'm just completely clueless, and any help would be really appreciated. So I work as a childcare professional, and one of the kids that I look after had recently gotten into hiking. I decided to take him to a really cool trail in Salt Fork State Park, and we were all set to hike to Hossack's Cave after parking right near the beginning of the trailhead. The entire trail is about maybe half a mile, which is why I chose this trail for our hike that day. I also chose this trail because any time that I had been on it before, it was very busy and full of people and a very popular spot, which made me feel secure. However, this past summer, we had a cluster of severe summer storms which caused massive damage to the trail, so to my surprise, it was much more difficult and completely empty as well. I wasn't bothered by the trail being obviously empty because there was a small construction crew working on a bridge that was just barely visible from the trailhead. He was still up for the hike too, despite the entire width of the trail being washed out until it was no more than a foot wide, with like a 6 to 12 foot drop off into the creek bed. That is solid rock, mind you, and several trees down. He was very athletic though, and I was confident in his abilities if he was. And he was also really excited to tackle our adventure, so we continued. We made it all the way to a platform that allows you to see the entire cave. There were many down trees surrounding the platform, and it was actually closed at this point. But we had made it this far, so we decided to maneuver around the platform and proceed the few hundred feet into the cave. We spent the most time in this area due to the difficulty, so I know exactly what it looked like. There were tree roots directly under the platform, and you could sort of climb up and down either side of them, and it was also worth noting that Hossack's Cave is much more like a cliff with an overhanging rock formation and a trickle of waterfall directly in the middle. It is not a creepy closed-up cave by any means, and so it was very open and very beautiful. In any case, we got to the cave and I noticed a candle that was not burning recently, but had been at some point, sitting on a large rock that had a heart carved into it. I chalked it up to someone having a date or something and disregarded it. He wanted to climb up to the top, where I noticed 2 more candles and 3 stacks of small rocks that had been stacked up by somebody. I definitely felt weird at this point, but it was about this time that he found a small puddle full of baby salamanders and he wanted to catch them. It was honestly the happiest that I'd seen him in a very long time, and I didn't have the heart to tell him that it was time to go. We spent about an hour catching baby salamanders, and I watched him have the time of his life. Eventually, though, we finally decided to leave, and when we got to the platform, dead center in the middle of the tree roots was a wet washcloth hanging that was absolutely not there before, and he noticed it as well, but didn't pick up on the severity of the situation that we were in. At that moment, I factually knew 2 things. 1, someone was definitely watching us and we didn't see them. And 2, they were now potentially hiding in the woods and made it a point not to be seen but to leave an object to be noticed. There was no running back with the narrow trail, and I was not about to tell him that we were in potential danger. I told him to go in front of me, and I just kept encouraging him that he was doing great over and over, and that thankfully seemed to speed him up naturally. I never did see anyone while we were on that trail. We got to the car, and I locked the doors immediately once inside. And on our way out of the park, a very dirty man, probably in his 30s I would guess, came out of the woods and made it a point to stare at me with the most empty of expressions that I had ever seen. The man followed me with his eyes and his head as I drove by him, and continued to stare at me until I couldn't see him anymore. I knew the third fact at that point, that he had made it a point to make himself apparent to me, and that facts 1 and 2 were true. That stare stuck with me for days too, and I considered counseling after this, as it bothered me for several weeks, causing me severe anxiety for some reason. I tried to tell myself that maybe we just interrupted his bath time and he was camping and didn't want to startle us or something. After all, the crazy-looking man had ample time to do something that he wanted while we were catching salamanders. I just cannot in any way rationalize why he stared into my eyes the way that he did if he wanted to go unnoticed, though. Deep down, I know that it is much more likely that it was a deliberate action intended to scare me. He never had any idea how panicked I was, and to this day, it was the most fun that I'd ever seen him have. He brings it up regularly, and it was a very positive experience for him. But it was one of the worst experiences ever for me, and it made me feel really sick and really disturbed. So I think it's important that I preface this story by stating that I'm always looking for a scientific or logical explanation to anything weird that I encounter, but this had me scared beyond reason, and I've had a hard time finding any explanation. So I work as a care provider and help run homes of folks that we care for. One client I worked with was a man in his 50s. However, his health was declining to the point that most people assumed that he was in his late 70s or 80s. This is relevant too. Whenever I went into his home, I just got uncomfortable vibes, is the best way to describe it. I would always feel extremely depressed or anxious and uncomfortable when I was there. I work with a lot of different people all over the city that I live, in and out of all kinds of homes, and I only ever got those kinds of vibes once before, and that was years ago, but it never felt this bad. It made the home feel, I don't know, oppressive whenever I was there. I just hated being there by myself because of it too. But a few months ago, I started realizing that I was remembering the vibe felt familiar from the other home from years before. As I sat in the kitchen on my laptop one afternoon, I started doing some research on the property to see if I could find any information on its history. Nothing unusual for it, just an older building from what I could find. I also started texting my sister if she ever got that uncomfortable vibe in the other house that I mentioned earlier, because she had also worked there as well. Once I started texting and narrowing down my internet search, to see if I could find any information on if anyone had ever passed away or worse in the home. It was like the house knew that I was doing this. The air became heavy. All of the normal hummings of the electric appliances amped up to an uncomfortable loud buzz, and I had to cover my ears because I felt like they were going to pop from the pressure change. The lights overhead got brighter and buzzed as well, and I immediately shut my laptop and left the room. I told my sister that I would have to get back to her because I was done with even thinking about this, as to not agitate whatever took notice. Anyway, fast forward a couple of months. Nothing else major ever happened like that, but I was still always uncomfortable. My client's health continued to decline until earlier this year, when he eventually had to go into more intensive care. I came back one day to gather some things for him and some paperwork. It was a quick in and out visit, and as I went to exit and shut the door, I could sort of see across the main room into the kitchen, where it looked like what I can describe as only a dark silhouette figure just ducked out of sight, but I saw it. I know that I was completely alone in that house too, and I just immediately shut the door and left without looking behind me. I don't know what that was that I experienced there, but it felt like I wasn't supposed to take notice of whatever was there. The scariest part about all of this, though, is that I sort of think that it was feeding off of my client's life force, since he moved in a few years prior and caused rapid aging and decline in health. I'm not going to share anything specific about him, but it was strange how relatively young he actually was, given his physical condition and appearance. This happened 3 nights ago, and I'm going crazy trying to figure it out. I just moved into a new apartment 1 month ago, and I'm still unpacking and settling in. I've been using my parents' address as my mailing address, who live a few towns over, 20 minutes away, all my life. 3 nights ago, my parents called me at 2 in the morning, freaked out, and proceed to tell me this story. Apparently, at 1 in the morning, someone starts banging on their front door and repeatedly ringing their doorbell. My stepdad walks downstairs and opens the door, leaving the front glass door closed and locked. There was a man standing outside, who looked to be in his 30s, with a black hoodie on with the hood pulled up around his face. He didn't have any distinguishing facial features, facial hair, or tattoos. The only thing my stepdad said was that he looked to be Hispanic, perhaps. Neither my stepdad or my mother, who was watching the whole thing out of a window, recognized the man. But the man then says, I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for," and gives my full name. My stepdad plays dumb and says, "Who?" The man proceeds to state my full name again, and says that my boyfriend is worried because I didn't come home that night. He claims to be a friend of my boyfriend and tells my stepdad that they're both out looking for me, worried because I didn't show up at home. Mind you, I don't have a boyfriend. I live by myself with my 3 dogs and haven't been in a relationship in the past 5 to 6 months. But here's the weird part. My stepdad asks the guy what boyfriend he was talking about, and the man tells him the name of the boyfriend that I had when I was in 10th grade, nearly 20 years ago. My boyfriend in the 10th grade has a very, very unique Italian name. I've never met anyone with a full name even close to his, but he says my high school boyfriend's name a few more times to ensure that my stepdad hurt him, and repeats that they're very worried about me. Is my stepdad sure that I'm not inside? At this point, my stepdad is weirded out and closes and locks the door in his face. But the man doesn't leave. He lingers in front of my parents' house for the next 10 minutes, smoking cigarettes and talking on the phone. Finally, my parents call the cops, and about 5 minutes before the cops arrive, the man walks down to the dead end on their block and drives away in a silver car. My stepdad was unable to get the license plate. My parents file a police report, and after that, nothing else happens. After I hear this story, though, I'm just going crazy over the weird details. I mean, how would someone know who I dated nearly 20 years ago, And what would the motive be of making up a story that included that weird detail about my past? I have not had contact with the 10th grade boyfriend in over a decade. Yesterday I decided to message him on Facebook though to see if he has any insight. I tell him the whole story and he's just as confused as I am and claims to have no part in it. At this point, I'm just at a loss, and I'm also really freaked out that some strange man is going through that much trouble at 1 a.m. to look for me. If you have any insights or ideas of what this could be, then do let me know, because I have a feeling that something fishy is going on. So back in 2015, my sister and I are home alone watching Craigslist horror stories on YouTube. I know, it's pretty ironic. But for reference, I was 13 while my sister was 17, and having these watch parties had become something of a habit for us, as it was our last year together before she went off to college. We lived in a pretty safe neighborhood, and nothing had ever really happened at that point that would give us any reason to be anxious about being alone. But anyway, time goes on and my sister suggests that we order a pizza since she was hungry. I'm not one to turn down a pizza, so I naturally agree and we place an order at a local pizza place. We continue watching our videos for another 15 to 20 minutes before I step out to use the restroom. And just then I hear the doorbell ring, followed by my sister getting up to go and answer it. So I carry on with my business with the assumption that it was just the pizza. I would say that maybe only 2 minutes had passed as I come back out and realize that my sister was still at the door talking with someone. I couldn't really make out what was being said, but I knew that it was definitely a man's voice responding to her. As I go to see what's going on, my sister promptly shuts the door, pizza in hand. I initially assumed maybe there was just an issue with the payment, so I just teased my sister for taking so long and go and sit down. I know. Who thought a 13-year-old boy could be such an oblivious person, right? It didn't take long, though, for me to realize, though, that my sister wasn't eating, despite this whole thing being her idea, and even more so, she had a very nervous look on her face now and wasn't speaking much. I asked her what was up, and she proceeds to tell me that when she opened the door to greet the pizza guy, he looked at her as if he was checking her out, and followed up by giving her the most unsettling smile that she'd ever seen. She was trying to get the pizza and go, as we'd already paid online, but the creep insisted on trying to make conversation with her. The man pretended to fumble around trying to get the pizza box out of his bag, all while asking very personal questions that he certainly had no business asking, like how old she was and if she was alone and stuff like this. Now, I admittedly thought that she was just messing with me at first. I mean, stuff like that can never actually happen to people that you know, right? Nevertheless, it still left me feeling a bit anxious. We tried to enjoy the food and move on, and I'd say about an hour or two later, we had finally calmed down about the whole thing. Right as we were getting ready to clean up and go back to our own rooms, there's a knock at the door, a very loud and aggressive one at that. We share the same nervous look and then hesitantly slip over to the window to see if we can get a look at whoever's knocking. Now, I hadn't seen the guy, but my sister immediately recognized him as the pizza guy from before. We were contemplating calling the police, but the guy had only knocked once or twice more before getting in his car and taking off way too fast down the road, almost like he knew that if he continued, he was more than likely to go and end up in a lot of trouble. We made a round around the house, though, making sure everything was locked up, and then waited for what felt like ages for our parents to finally get home. My sister told them about what happened, but our mum insisted that we were just being dramatic, that we had just made ourselves nervous because of the videos that we were watching. And while we both initially insisted on being serious, we eventually gave up and just tried to move on from the whole thing. We ordered from that place a few more times, but thankfully we never saw that same delivery man again. Nothing else ever really came out of that situation, but I can't help but think about what could have happened if that creep had just been a bit more persistent. What if he had kept trying to get into the house, or if we had accidentally left the door unlocked? I think that his intentions were pretty obvious, and I can only hope that his behavior has caught up with him, and that he's somewhere getting the help that he probably needs. When I was in first through second grade, the neighbors at the end of the block, they terrorized my family, and their son terrorized our next-door neighbors. The next-door neighbors, they were a family that we were close with, and I'll start with that first. So Junior, the teenage psychopath, was friends with their son, who was the same age. My brother and I were always there playing with their daughter, who was my age. Our mums were close, and the mum was Maria, and she was very pretty. One day her son told us that he was going to kill Junior. Maria told my mum that Junior had apparently been peeping in her window, so she decided to film him to get evidence because she kept finding something white on her windows. She found out that Junior was playing with himself to her undressing. He would then wipe everything on her windows, and this was before our family had problems with his family. One day, my dad, an avid cyclist, noticed his very expensive bike was missing. He saw Junior riding it around the neighborhood. He'd stolen it out of our garage, and my dad went to his father and told him to get his son to give his bike back. His father yelled at my dad and denied Junior stole anything. Luckily, he left the bike in their driveway, and my dad took it back and kept it in the basement after that. But a few days later, someone knocked on our back door, and my dad looked outside to see a plate of rice with a dead crow on it. He called the police, but since he didn't see who put it there, they didn't do anything. When we would go out, we would leave our bunny and guinea pig in their cage outside to get some fresh air, and my mum and brother and I were only out for a short period of time. My dad was in the basement. But when we got home, we went straight to our backyard that had a fence and big bushes in the back. Our kiddie pool had been out, and this is what we found. Our bunny had been drowned in the pool, and our guinea pig was thrown over the extremely high bushes into the valley. It was devastating for us at the time. Piglet, our guinea pig, was still alive, and my mum took her to the animal hospital. She had severe internal bleeding, though, and her bones were broken, so she had to be put to sleep. But I just could not believe the cruelty. All over my dad confronting Junior's dad over the bike. So my mum went over to their house and confronted the father. He readily admitted doing it, saying that they were just animals. He apparently did it with a friend, and I can't remember how my parents figured that out, but I think Maria's mother saw them in our backyard or something. The police were called, but again, nothing happened. But that wasn't the end, though. You see, one night, I woke up to my dog Wrinkles going crazy. She was sleeping on my bed. My bed was facing my windows. Then I heard knocking, and I also heard a male voice saying something about coming in. He also called me names, and I also heard some expletives, but I then saw Junior. I then ran into my parents' room crying hysterically, saying that somebody was trying to get into my room. My dad went outside and saw one of our patio chairs outside my very open window. He called the police. They searched outside my window, and they saw shoe prints. The cops thought that there might be two people, though, because of how many shoe prints were on the ground. They went to the neighbor's house, but his mother said that Junior wasn't home. He was out with friends, apparently. But I bet that they were in his house, but the police couldn't search it. I was traumatized afterwards, and my bed was moved so I couldn't see the windows. I was terrified to be at home, though, especially at night. My parents bought lights that you can run along the entire house and around the patio to my window. But I still get afraid at night if the blinds are open. Nothing ever happened to Junior, too, because there was no evidence that it was him. Plus, someone in his family was a cop, apparently, so there was that. It explains, though, why he wasn't sent to jail for what he did to Maria, who actually had caught it on camera. I also forgot to mention, too, that my mum was talking to his mum before any of this started, and his mum referred to her husband as the man. She hated him and joked about poisoning his food, and apparently he died of a heart attack shortly after Junior climbed in my window, apparently, and we've always thought that maybe she finally did follow through with that threat. So this is literally something that I thought that I would never share. I'm not a believer in ghosts by any means. I'm 26 years old and have lived my whole life without seeing anything paranormal whatsoever. However, myself and my wife have been experiencing some very weird things happen in our house. You see, 2 nights ago, my wife was asleep with our daughter in her room and I was in the master bedroom. I had gotten up at about 1:30 in the morning to get a late snack, and while I was in the kitchen, my wife came to the kitchen and asks me, "What, babe?" I was completely confused and said, "What do you mean?" Because apparently she had heard the doorknob move pretty hard, so hard that she thought that it was locked and I was trying to open it. She was annoyed, but I told her that I didn't do it at all. I was pretty sure that she was dreaming and just heard me opening cookies, so it was just whatever at that moment. But just a couple of hours ago, however, she was here with my sister-in-law in my daughter's room. Again, I was in the living room and cleaning, and she came out to see what I was doing. Apparently, they thought that I was playing a prank on them because the door handle had moved 3 times, and they both saw it moving. It took me at least 30 minutes to convince them that I didn't do it. My wife saw it happen again while we were all searching the house, and there is definitely nobody in there. This is recent, but there were 2 separate times months ago where my daughter's room had toys making noise non-stop for at least an hour straight. I was too afraid to turn it off, too afraid to even move because it was 2 in the morning, and I was alone in the living room, so that made no sense. I had to wake my wife up to come with me and pull the batteries out in the end, but like I said, I'm not a believer, but now I'm just not so sure anymore. I mean, I've looked at every reasonable explanation for the doorknob, but there's just no way that it could move by itself like that. So, what could this possibly be? When I was a kid, about roughly 9 years old, I'm 20 now, I used to sneak out at night and walk throughout my neighborhood sometimes. I was a weird kid. I used to watch a lot of scary stuff on YouTube and stuff like that, and I would spend my nights literally shaking out of fear, but that didn't stop me. My neighborhood is full of abandoned houses that were mostly left untouched after the war in 1995. I'm from Bosnia. I always wanted to explore them as a kid, but never could as I was a bit shy. And that meant that somebody seeing me exploring and giving me a weird look would always make me run, and I don't know why I was like this, but that's not important now. But there was this huge house that was always surrounded by really large grass that was taller than me even, and I really wanted to explore it. I had asked my mum a bunch of times to go with me, but she obviously declined and banned me from going. But one night, I grabbed my dad's flashlight from the closet, climbed through the window of my room like I had before many times, and this time I went to the house. It was midnight. I arrived quickly as it was only a few houses from mine. Seeing no cars, I ran through the tall grass and ended up seeing a boarded-up window. There was a tight gap that I managed to crawl through, and I entered the house, and to my surprise, the room that I was in had nothing in it, like literally nothing. Not even a beer bottle or a cigarette. The house had no real windows or doors, so I could hear a sort of hissing sound of the wind. I walked around for a bit, and I realized that there was nothing really special about it, and that I probably should have just stayed in bed. But while I was walking around, I would stop sometimes because I could have sworn that I heard somebody else walking in there, like the walking of heavy boots on stone or something. I froze, thinking that there was somebody in the house with me. I stood frozen for 5 minutes, and when I could no longer hear the sound, I continued to the 2nd floor. The first room that I saw on the 2nd floor was the bathroom. It had a toilet broken in half and a bathtub filled with dirty water. On the floor of it, I spotted something metal. I continue walking, and I see an attic, like a hole in the roof of the house leading somewhere. There was a ladder nearby, and as I went to get it, I saw something small, like really small, like a sort of a lighter sprinting across the room. I stood there, and as a kid, of course, I started to cry a little bit. I can't really explain what I saw, but it didn't look like a bug or a rat, but more like a humanoid creature. As I started crying, I sprinted to the window as quickly as I could that I came through. Looking behind me, I could make out a silhouette as well, like a man holding something. I jumped for the gap, and while trying to get out, I heard a huge bang, like from a gunshot or something. I sprinted back to my house, and I went back in through the window, and I went to bed. I couldn't sleep for nights after that, and my mother eventually took me to a doctor. They said that nothing was wrong with me, and a few years later I decided to bring up this story with my mum. She laughed at me but told me something that really sent chills down my spine. So the story goes that in the war between the Serbs and the Bosniaks, that house was used by the Serbs as a slaughterhouse. It is estimated that over 200 Bosniaks were killed in that house. When my mum told me that, I just went to my room and could barely believe it. The metal thing that I had found in that house was probably a bullet shell. To this day, I don't know if there was actually somebody in that house, or perhaps if there was something paranormal going on, but in any case, I'm just glad that I got out of there when I did. This was right around when I was entering 8th grade. I remember all of the events vividly, like it happened yesterday too. At this house that we had, it was amazing. It was a huge one-story house. The backyard was massive, bordering a riverbed too. There was a huge metal shed in the back that looked like it was used to work on semi-trucks. It was a 4-bedroom house, and my brother's room, which was technically a den, was converted into a room as well. It had long corridors to get to all other parts of the house. The kitchen was long like a hall lined with counters. To get to the 3 bedrooms on the other side of the house, we had to pass the living room and then walk down the long hallway that was L-shaped. My mother's room was at the end of this long hallway, which is where most of the worst events happened. I only know my other siblings' and parents' encounters because they told me as an adult, where before they didn't want to scare me, I guess, because I also had my own experiences that they knew about. So, it started with small things like just uneasy feelings, weird smells like baby powder, misplaced objects, knocking on doors early in the mornings, but the first major incident was when my uncle lived with us. We were sitting in the living room and we had one of those old school big screen TVs, you know, the ones that basically took up the whole corner of the room. There was my uncle's phone on top charging. Keep in mind this is a flat surface as my mum had decorations on top of this TV. But we were watching TV when suddenly we all watched the phone light up the corner of the room, super bright with just the screen, and before my uncle could move to check it, it flew off the TV. I don't mean like it slid, like it legit flew, as if someone had struck it and it just went flying across the room. We all got startled by that. My mum came running from the kitchen, and my uncle, which is about in his 30s at the time, explains exactly what happened. In shock, he said, "No one touched it. It lit up bright and then just freaking flew off the TV." We all kind of brushed it off, but it was nevertheless the first event of many. The next event kind of jumps from harmless to major, I think, but my brother was in the kitchen washing his plate from breakfast, when suddenly he explains feeling a real dreadful feeling. But he said that he ignored it, and as he was standing there, he said it felt like a gush of wind passed by him. He even said that he felt a tug on his shirt. Thinking that it was one of our many siblings, he spun around to see who was there, but there was no one. He was alone. Kind of freaked out, he told my mum what happened since she's the most spiritual out of all of us. She's a big-time Christian. And stay with me here because we're kind of going to jump around in timeliness based on harmless encounters to the worst ones. So, I remember getting ready for school one morning too, and I began to feel the anxiety and dreadful feeling again. I began to scan my room as I tied my shoes on the chair facing the doorway, and it was at this point that I caught a glimpse of an all-black hand wrap around the doorframe of my room. I jumped back, startled, and I saw a full black face peer from the corner of my doorframe. Its face was pasty black, Its eyes were all black and it was wearing an old feather hat sort of thing. I jumped up and screamed, and it quickly disappeared from the doorway. My mum came running in, and I explained with tears in my eyes about what I had just seen. She didn't play it off either, and she started to pray with me. And then finally, this is my last experience in this house, although my other siblings continued to have things happen to them. It was my bedtime, and I shared a room with my older brother. I didn't like sleeping alone, after seeing whatever that thing was that was watching me tie my shoes that day. But my brother had a late bedtime because he was in high school. I would go to bed first alone, and I remember being scared but falling asleep that night. I awoke to a silent, dark room at some stage, and for some reason, I couldn't move. I looked around the room from my top bunk bed, and we had these huge glass mirrors for closet doors, and in the reflection, I watched a creature crawl out from under the bed and hop onto the bottom bunk where my brother was sleeping. It was staring at me, and it had piercing red eyes. The only way that I can explain it too is that it looked like an evil monkey. I began to scream and cry because I couldn't move. My brother began to wake up. This thing hops off my brother's bed and quickly goes back under the bed. My brother jumps up and turns on the light. I explained what happened as I could move and talk now. He went to get my mum, and I remember being terrified, being left there alone in that room, while he went to get my mum. But she came in and we prayed, and after that, I think I went to bed and eventually I fell asleep. So, like I said, those are my experiences, but these next events are all from my siblings. So my sister often had vivid dreams of a body hanging from the window in the restroom, even to the point that she had a dream of my oldest brother hanging there. There was just something about that wall in the restroom and the window. Everyone felt uneasy about it, even before my sister ever mentioned the dreams about it. I remember being woken up by my brother at one point. He explained that he was in the restroom, and as he sat there, he said that he became fixated on the wall and the window. He began to feel panic and fear. He said the lights flickered and he caught a glimpse of a noose hanging from the window frame, and he freaked out and quickly finished and ran out of the restroom. Now, I've never seen fear in any of my brother's eyes, but that night was different. He asked me to stay awake with him that night. I agreed, and we talked all night till the sun came up and there was light in the room. And we both fell asleep once enough light was in the room from outside that we felt safe. This next one is from the perspective of my older sister. My sister would often hear children playing in the hallway from her room, or inside of her room even. The sounds changed from just laughing and small voices to children eventually calling her name. She would explain when she took a shower that she would hear them outside of the door calling her. When she would be in her room, she would hear them calling from down the hallway. She was always freaked out and still to this day says that she hated that house. This next one is from the perspective of my older brother. He was asleep when suddenly he was awoken by a loud noise. He explained that he tried to move but couldn't. The bed began to shake violently and the walls were cracking and shaking. He honestly thought that there was an earthquake for a moment, but he couldn't move. As he lay there helpless, he said that it was almost like a train was running through the room. Everything was shaking and there were sounds of a train running over tracks. He said that he closed his eyes and started to pray, and when he opened them, the room was back to normal. No cracks, no shaking, no noise. This same brother would have this same experience multiple times too, except every time was different. Sometimes he would hear trains, people talking like a busy train station, and other times he would hear children screaming and crying. To this day, he still has no explanation for what he heard or anything that he saw. The next one is half my perspective and half my sister-in-law's. For perspective too, we had a dining room which had a door to the front of the house. It was connected to the long kitchen, and the doorway to my brother's room was on the right. We also had a computer in the corner, and I remember watching a movie in my brother's room, which was the den converted into a room that I spoke about earlier. We all fell asleep on the floor, and I remember being woken up by some sort of a loud sound. I hear my sister-in-law saying, "What the heck is that?" I rolled over, and I hear that too. Everyone around us was asleep, but it sounded like somebody was on the computer typing on the keyboard. with the occasional clicking of the mouse even. She said go and check, and I was too afraid due to the past events, but I reluctantly checked to see nothing. The computer was off, and we both were freaked out, but after a while, we must have fallen back to sleep. This was the beginning of my siblings and parents seeing things too. One of my brothers were walking through the hallway and explained seeing a figure of a man standing in the doorway of my mum's room at the end of the hall. He said that it looked at him and reached for the doorknob and walked outside to the patio. This next one too was one of the scariest things to happen. My uncle was living with us still at the time, and I remember walking in the door with my parents. He immediately stops us and says, "You guys have demons in this house. There's something seriously wrong with this place." I remember the despair on my parents' face, knowing exactly what he meant too. He explains to us that coming home to an empty house, nobody was home, he walked in the doorway and looked down the hall, and he explained seeing two small children run from the corner of the L-shaped hall and into my sister's room, the one that always heard the children calling her and playing in the hallway. He was surprised because his logical explanation was that my mum left some of us to do something. He walked into my sister's room to ask what we were doing home alone, but he didn't find anyone in the room. He said that he checked everywhere too, convinced that there were children still at home. But just when he was about to give up, he suddenly heard laughing in the hallway. When he looked down to the hallway, he saw the same small children run from the bathroom into my room, only just catching a glimpse. He was now confused because he said that no one passed him to go back out of my sister's room. He said that he was upset and called our names to come out from hiding and stop playing with him. He searched the whole house, but found no one. He was home alone. I remember sitting there too, scared listening to this because the last room that they entered was mine. The next story is my mother's story. She explained that my oldest brother, who works nights, would sneak into her room in the early morning and sit on her bed to let them know that he was home, and they would get up and drink a coffee and just talk sometimes. She explained being woken up by the sound of her door opening, and she said that she had a feeling that it was not my brother though, and instead of my brother coming straight to the bed, she heard her cupboards open and someone sort of rummaging through them. Then they closed and she heard footsteps heading toward her bed. Then she felt someone sit on the bed. She turned around to say hi to my brother, but when she did, nobody was there. She explained that there was an impression on the bed though, as if someone was actually sitting there. My mother, being the God-fearing woman that she was, laughed and began to pray. That's when she said the impression disappeared and she heard footsteps leaving her room. The next story is the same brother who had something pull on his shirt in the kitchen that night. It's the same thing. He was washing his dish, except we were all in the kitchen cleaning up from breakfast, when suddenly he said that he felt the gush of wind again and something pulled him harder this time. He turned around to see and remembers getting up off the floor with everyone around him. But from my perspective, he just blacked out. He collapsed onto the floor with no warning. We even had the paramedics come that night, but in the end he was fine. No one could explain what happened either, and it was weird. But this house was something evil. We always knew that something was wrong with it, but we finally had the answers. We were all in the living room watching TV one morning when I remember my mum opening the front door. She moved her attention to some random guy standing in the front yard. He said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't mean to scare you. I used to live here when I was a kid." My mum said, "Oh, you did?" He said, "Yeah, like 20 years ago." My mum said, "Can I ask you some questions?" And he said, "What do you want to know? But before you ask, yes, the house is haunted or cursed," he said with a scared look. My mum, shocked, asked him to explain, and he began to explain all the experiences that we've been having. My mum was pretty shocked by this and says, "Well, what about the knocking or the baby powder?" He says, "Oh, that was my mum. She had a heart attack in the back restroom. Don't worry, she would knock on our doors in the morning to let us know that she was still around, since apparently she did that when she was alive. She would wear a lot of baby powder for some reason too, like it would fluff off her when she sat down, and which explains the knocking earlier in the mornings and the powder smell throughout the house, I guess, but He said you would have to be careful because there's an American native chief here as well. Well, we all said, what? He pulled out his phone and pulls up a picture. It's a picture of a developed photo, and it shows some people on the patio at a party. They're standing in the front of the bar that we have in the backyard, and behind them is a huge figure with a chief hat on his head, feathers and all, except his face is completely black, and so are his eyes. The man explained that there are several ghosts and demons in this house, apparently. He even explained that they had a theory that someone hung themselves in the restroom, which also explains the dreams that my sister would have and my brother seeing the rope that day. In the end, we thanked him, and he rode his bike away. We never did see that guy again, or figure out where he was from, or anything. And he was riding a bike, which was weird, but he couldn't have lived too far, I guess. But we never did see him again. After a few years, we moved out of that house. I was really happy too, because all the experiences ended once we moved. But I remember being in high school and my friend was talking about how he just moved across the street. He explained the house and it was the same one. I warned him and he laughed at me and said nothing has happened yet. But a few weeks later, he came up to me and said he believed me. He said that he was in the fridge getting milk this morning and no one was home, just him, and someone came super close to his ear and he could feel their breath on his neck, and they said in a low, deep voice, "What are you doing here?" Throughout the school year, he would tell me all the things that would happen there, which actually in turn were way worse than what we ever experienced. I believe that whatever my mum was doing was protecting us there, which I'm thankful for. Obviously, there's a lot more to this and many more experiences, but these were by far the most standoutish, I guess you could say. In the end, I know it sounds a bit weird, but I guess I'm grateful for the experiences. It's definitely shaped my perspective on life and things in life, but I'm also very grateful that I no longer live there. My friend, a 25-year-old female from college, told me a harrowing story once that happened to her and her friends in high school. She's from Buffalo, New York, and often went on camping trips to local upstate campgrounds. When she was a senior, her and 4 of her friends went to a campsite fitted with rows of cabins on the water that people could rent. As the sun went down, the girls noticed that their neighbors, a few cabins down, a group of guys similar in age, were playing music and grooving around the campfire, drinking beers and whatnot, and one of the guys asked them all if they wanted to join in. When they got over there and started hanging with the guys, everything seemed completely normal and they were having a fun time. And as the night progressed, one of the guys there started to get sort of blackout drunk and eventually pulled out a revolver that he said belonged to his dad. He started waving it around and playing with it. This obviously freaked everyone out, his own friends included. Eventually, he started pointing the gun to his head and laughing, and while his friends were yelling at him to put it away and how that wasn't funny, he kept doing it. The girls at this point were fairly disturbed, and they told the guys that they should get back to their cabin, and they said their goodbyes. When they got back to their cabin, they all talked about how freaky that was and expressed concern for that drunk guy. They then moved on to other topics of conversation, and they forgot about it for the time being. But a few hours later, sometime in the middle of the night, they heard a loud bang coming from the direction of their neighbor's cabin. Shortly after this, a brigade of cop cars showed up to the scene. One officer came to my friend's cabin and started asking them questions about the cabin that they visited earlier that night. When my friend asked the officer what happened, he explained that the kid had actually shot himself in front of his friends. They weren't able to discern if it was suicide or if it was accidental. My friend to this day still has PTSD over this incident and explained that she rarely goes camping anymore. When 2 of my friends and I were juniors at Sunny Purchase College back in 2018, we decided to sneak into Playland Park in Rye, New York. One of the friends of mine grew up in Rye and had done it many times before, So while I was nervous about getting arrested for trespassing, I felt a bit reassured that the park wasn't very, well monitored at night, I guess you could say. And at around 1 a.m. we drove and parked our car next to a large fence and attempted to scale it. It was rather difficult and required us to step onto each other's hands to get over, which gave me an intense anxiety about how we were planning to get all three of us back over the fence on the way out. After both of my friends got over the fence though, I attempted to chicken out and wait in the car, but finally decided to join, and after several minutes of struggling, I made it over the fence on my own and we began walking while lighting up a joint. It was pitch black at this point and almost all the lights were off too. We approached the water flume ride, which went up about maybe 100 to 150 feet, and then dropped into a steep slope. Along the side of the ride was a staircase for technicians and employees, which my friends decided to climb for a better view. At this point though, I chickened out, and I decided to stay at the bottom out of fear of heights. As they ascended the stairs, I looked out across the park, and that was when I noticed something very strange. We weren't actually alone at the park, because several hundred feet from us was a pond with what appeared to be like a small boat or a raft inside of it, and 4 or so people riding inside of it with flashlights attached to their heads. What was even stranger though was the fact that there were 2 dark figures swimming in the pond looking for something underneath the water. I could barely make out the silhouettes of these figures, but after a few minutes I noticed that they could see us and they seemed to be immobilizing the boat in our direction. I frantically started whisper screaming to my friends who were all the way at the top of the water right now and could barely hear me. At this point, the boat had reached land and the little lights on their helmets were heading in our direction quickly. My friends finally raced down the stairs and we began sprinting as fast as we could down a boardwalk that was dimly lit and back towards the way that we came. As we sprinted down the long, straight boardwalk, I realized that we were completely visible and started to accept the reality of being caught and arrested. But we somehow rounded a corner, got back to the fence and climbed over safely, hopping into our car and dipping immediately. I couldn't believe and still can't believe that we didn't get caught that night, as the figures that were chasing after us were no more than like a few hundred feet away when they spotted us. Still to this day too, I'm really not sure why the heck those people were swimming around a pond in an amusement park at like 1:30 in the morning. But one day my friend had told me that apparently kids had drowned in that pond before, making me wonder if they were searching for a body or something. I googled any article that I could find, but to no avail. Me and my 2 friends are still totally puzzled by this experience and can't really think of a very logical explanation. But the fact that my friend said that there are rumors that kids are drowning in this pond, I don't know, just thinking about it gives me chills. My housemates and I are all 21 to 22-year-old females. We recently moved into a house near our college campus. We don't have keys and instead use a code that we use on the doors, but we have 3 pretty calm pets as well. So, it all started with weird individual experiences. Random small things going missing either from public spaces or somewhere private. But things that were easy to just sort of look over, I guess. Also, I should probably mention too that we're all very close and honest with each other. The things missing couldn't have been stolen and the house is not big, so there's only so many places the items could have been. And then there's been occurrences where we would leave with all the blinds open, come back and they were all closed. Blankets that were left out but are randomly folded. Things like this. It's been getting spookier recently too because one of my roommates was home alone and heard a thud. She looked around, all the pets were in the living room with her. She then hears footsteps and calls out to us with no answer. And so she grabs the pets and loads them into her car because she's hysterical and convinced that somebody else was in the home with her. But, to top it off, the other day, I was trying on some clothes and kept getting a hint of, I don't know, like something foul. After much investigation, I realized that it's the very shorts that I'm wearing. Confused, I sort of rummaged through my drawer and out of my 3 rows of shorts, the row in the middle smells and is stained with urine. I was obviously really disgusted by this, and I took them off quickly. But when I tell you that we've pondered every possible explanation from our pets to even ourselves, I mean it. But the smell wasn't that of a cat or a dog. There were no rat droppings, and I immediately registered that it was definitely human pee. After doing all of my laundry, I also noticed 2 identical pairs of my underwear are missing. They were nowhere to be found at all, and I mean, we searched high and low, and there's no way that a pet could get into it or take it or hide it or anything. But, I don't know, I just feel like I'm going crazy. If somebody else can please give us any, I don't know, like logical explanations, because maybe, just maybe, yours is the one that our brains will believe enough to help me sleep at night at this point. But if not, well, what should we do? Back when I was about 16 years old, because of my living situation, at least twice a month I would have to make a 2-hour drive from a city area back to my parents' house in a rural area. I'd say that about maybe 1.5 hours of that drive was just country road with nothing but valley, corn, or some other crop on either side with the occasional farmhouse, or something that you think that people might go in and out of willingly along the way. Because of how used to this drive I'd already been beforehand, I didn't think much of driving that long stretch of no cell service, no phone booth area. I mean, nothing had happened yet, so surely nothing would ever happen, right? Well, in the middle of one of these drives back, while the night was slowly taking over, as I was driving, I saw a flash of light. That was weird, I thought. Maybe just a momentary anemic moment, who knows? But then, another flash. Well, maybe someone coming this way has their high beams wonky or something? Another flash, though. Alright, something's definitely wrong. I slow down a bit so as not to get blinded periodically and swerve off the road, then try to figure out what was up ahead. Further in the distance, I think that I see a person. Actually, multiple people. My eyesight's well and good at this point in my life, so I was putting 2 and 2 together, getting close enough to realize that there were actually 4 people on this country road lined up across as if it was to make a roadblock to prevent any cars from passing through. Another note too is that I don't see any other car around them that they could have come in or anything. I don't remember any farmhouses or sheds nearby either. But the rest of this encounter felt like it took place in the span of an hour because of my anxiety, but it was likely no more than 5 minutes in hindsight. So I'm driving maybe 10 miles per hour now as I'm getting closer and realizing that I'm definitely without a doubt approaching a line of 4 grown people with huge bright white masks on, staring in my direction. 2 of them definitely have bats or some other distinctly long blunt objects, and one person is holding something that the flashes are coming from. Maybe a laser or something? I'm not sure. What I do know, though, is that I've seen enough horror movies and heard enough stories about crime on roads like this to think that, in that moment, I have only 2 options. Slow down and hope that they eventually part way around my car, running the risk that they could very well get the jump on me in my dinky car, or pick up the pace and disregard whether or not they'll have the chance to move out of the way when I potentially accelerate through them. In the end, I decided the latter. I had no means to protect myself with other than a bat in the trunk of my own car, and at that time, I was a young teen who passed as a girl who could easily get knocked down with a solid slap because of my build, and my car was terrible, bad enough in fact to where if I stopped I wouldn't doubt someone could break in with easy force. Now, hearing gravel and dirt kick up from under my tires, I was more freaked out of the potential that I could drive myself off the road, along with taking out some strangers, who I am now dead certain are carrying bats as I accelerate towards them. I'm proper freaking out, but I've accepted that this was the decision that I'd made. I accelerated more, and thankfully, the 2 that were directly in my way lunged out of the way just in time to not get hit. When I get past them, I stop accelerating to catch my breath, and to see them in my rearview mirror, the other 2 for some reason trying to haul butt towards my car as if they could catch up. And it became so real in that moment that There were people who were intentionally trying to get the jump on me in the middle of nowhere, and probably not just kids trying to get kicks and giggles out of freaking someone out, but real adults trying to harm someone that came that way. In any case, I just focused on driving out of there as fast as I could. I focused on going forward, didn't turn the radio back on to distract me, and felt shook by the experience in general. But the most messed up part, honestly, was getting home and realizing that part of what I was driving on wasn't gravel. It was actually nails that were now embedded into my tires. Praise whatever God may be out there for me somehow having those sturdy tires that got me home, because honestly, they looked terrible. I didn't tell my parents the full story about what happened in the end, and they just assumed that I was being reckless and someone was playing a prank with just scattering some nails about randomly on the road. I did tell the story to some of my friends, and they told me that I probably wasn't in any serious situation and they were just trying to get a scare out of me, especially since being in a car was a pretty big advantage in this situation which I was in, and I can't deny that. But still, it creeped me out a lot, and these days I remember it every single time that I drive down a road that looks any type similar. So last night at around 8:30, I went out to the edge of the woods on my property to set up a blind to shoot some nuisance coyotes that had been eating my chickens. I live in New Hampshire, at an area where people who live near these woods commonly refer to phenomena known as bad nights. It's just an eerie feeling where you don't want to be anywhere near a door or a window when it gets dark, and you certainly don't want to be outside. Animal life seems to be affected as well, since it's always eerily quiet on those nights. Thankfully, though, it was a good night, so I thought that I was going to be fine. I set up with a long-ranged modified handgun, a mounted night vision scope with a thermal setting, and a high-end night vision handheld. Both pieces of equipment have a high four-figure price range. I set up facing the woods, and for most of the night I saw nothing, coyote or otherwise. But a little before 10:30, I was scanning the field just before the tree line with my thermal scope when I saw like a red orb pop up. It was about 4 feet off the ground, not moving. The thermal was giving a reading of 90 degrees, which made no sense considering that it was around 40 that night. Also, the scope is very high definition. I can see small birds at 50 yards away, and they show up perfectly bird-shaped. So there's really no reason that anything should look like round like this. It also had a strange low-quality, staticky look to it, which AIs made no sense considering it was well within my 50-yard marker at the tree line. When I went to switch to night vision mode, it disappeared. After that, I never saw anything else like it for the rest of the night. But later on, around 11, my handheld night vision scope started malfunctioning. The brightness or exposure was sort of fluctuating wildly for no reason, and it was randomly turning on and off. I just chalked it up to the battery being dead or dying and stopped using it. But this afternoon, when I started to get my equipment ready again, it was working perfectly normal. It's the same temperature again today as well, 40 degrees, so it's not temperature related. But the final weird thing was that at around midnight, right as I was packing up to head inside, after having no luck with my coyote problem as my gun jammed and the animals ran off, I also could have swore that I heard a voice laughing. It sounded echoey, and due to being on a hill and there not being a lot of trees, I really couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. I thought that it was my neighbor who lives on the other side of the field. I should probably note that the house was not in the direction that I was firing towards, just so no one comes for me about gun safety and all that, but the house was 200 feet behind me and to the left. So, this morning, my neighbor was talking with me about how my hunt went, and I joked with her that she should know considering that she laughed after I missed my shot, but she was really confused. And I said I heard laughing and assumed it was from her house, and she said that nobody in the house was outside or even awake at that time of night. So, I don't know about any of this, but what do you guys think? A forest ghost messing with my equipment and laughing at me, or just equipment malfunctions? I'm going out again tonight, and I'll try to record if anything like that happens again. But lastly, just for the purpose of giving more context, I don't believe that the gear of this sort of caliber would malfunction like this as it did and just be fine the next day. It's really good equipment, and there's just no reason for it to behave like that. This happened when I was a freshman in high school on Halloween night. My friends and I weren't quite at the point in high school where we would have any sort of Halloween party to go to, and we were too cool to go trick-or-treating, of course. We were a tight-knit group of girls, though, and we grew up together since we were like babies, and we lived in a rural town outside of city limits. To set the scene, this is a very remote woodsy area. One of the friends, her name is T, her parents raised chickens and had about 50 acres filled with chicken houses, which we would explore on her four-wheeler after school often. The build-up to this night was filled with adrenaline and methodical planning. In our small town, one of the more thrill-seeking activities to do was what we call rolling yards. If you're not from a southern or rural area, this is basically throwing rolls of toilet paper up into trees so that streams of toilet paper hang down. Like, if you wanted to do a classic prank, rolling yards. Had a crush on a guy from class, rolling yards. Girl drama revenge? You get the point. It's hard to explain the kind of adrenaline that you would get sneaking down a rural two-lane road in the pitch black, turning down a long gravel driveway, threatening the group's lives if they make a sound. And if you get caught, your parents find out, and maybe worse, you're stuck cleaning up the mess for the next day or two. So, my friends and I had decided the 2 weeks prior to this night that we were going to go on a Halloween rampage, and specifically, we were going to roll the creepy house right down the rural road of my friend, where T lived on. This house had been a big scary story between my friends and I for years. We would go on afternoon walks after school and pass by it often. No one ever came in or out of the house, but T's parents told us that a man lived there that was a bit of a creep. She gave us a strict warning to stay away from that area, and looking back, T's mum worked in law enforcement, and she probably had many more reasons for us to stay away than she told us at the time, of course. Anyway, the night would go as such. T's older sister, B, who was 17 at the time, would drive us to the local Walmart, after T's mum and dad went to bed, that is. B was the kind of cool older sister who was in our sort of shenanigans and thought that it was fun to chaperone us when we were doing crazy things. All five of us loaded up in the backseat of B's car, piling onto each other's laps, blaring our favorite 2000s hip-hop songs and flying down the two-lane curvy road. Which is a scary thought in and of itself at this point in my life, but thank God nothing happened. We park in the near-empty parking lot of the store at around 11:30 and made our way towards the toilet paper aisle, hyped up on pure adrenaline. We filled 2 shopping carts completely full of 99-cent rolls of toilet paper, snickering to ourselves as the clerk eyed us suspiciously while checking us out. We ran, giddy, back to B's car, popped the trunk, and threw the loads of paper into the trunk. On the way back towards T's town, out of city limits, we turned down the music to discuss the play-by-play of the attack. B would park down a dirt road that led to some cow pastures about a mile from the man's, we'll call him Mr. S's driveway, to wait on us. The 5 of us would split up into teams, walking along the edge of the woods by the road quietly, in the event that a car would pass, so that we could drop to the ground and hide if we needed to. We filled our arms full of rolls of toilet paper and we headed toward the long gravel driveway of Mr. S's place. The adrenaline practically was beating out of my eardrums at this point, the crickets in the background screeching in synchronicity. We make it about 10 yards from the entrance of the driveway and we unload the toilet paper that we had carried. Then we quietly made our way towards B's trunk to get the next load of toilet paper. Once all the paper was piled into our checkpoint location at the edge of the woods by the entrance, we each grabbed 4 rolls and went into the woods, along each side of the gravel driveway to creep towards the house. We were all whispering to each other to shut up and be quiet, but we finally see the faint light coming from the side of the house by Mr. S's garage, and it was the most terrified that I'd ever been. Not only was the house 1000% creepier in this moment than when we walked past it during the day, but the thought of getting caught by the man that we were specifically told to stay away from was nauseating. T, the bravest and most rambunctious of the bunch, decides to make a beeline towards the garage while walking through the edge of the woods, and we watched her in pure shock. She stood near the woods, peeking out, and motioned for us to make our move, confirming that no lights in the house were on and Mr. S was 99% likely asleep inside. I stood, frozen, scared that I would pee my pants if I moved, but was ushered along by another girl who pointed to a tall oak tree at the very front of Mr. S's house, which was the worst location imaginable. I decided my teammates were worth it though, and I ripped open a pack of toilet paper and hurled it up towards the sky towards the highest branch on the tree, watching the stream of white paper fly down and catch the wind. Soon, streams of white were falling out of every tree surrounding the house, and we were getting very cocky and even more fearless the longer that we attacked. All of a sudden though, my friend T stopped dead in her tracks and made a loud hush noise. I stopped, hiding behind a tree, my heart literally in my throat, as I now saw what looked like lights turning on from inside the house out of the corner of my eye. T then whisper yelled, "Run!" and we dropped our remaining rolls of toilet paper and began running in the pitch black dark into the woods. Another girl in the group tripped and fell on a branch behind me, and I turned to help her up, when I heard it. Several gunshots rang loudly from near the house, and Mr. S was yelling maniacally into the woods, "You think you're funny? Not so funny when I find you." But we kept running, all crying and wheezing from the adrenaline and the speed in the night, towards the entrance of the driveway, and when we were about to reach the entrance, we heard something even worse than gunshots. The sound of a diesel truck engine coming down the gravel driveway slowly. We quickly went as deep into the woods as we could go without notifying him we were hiding, and stood silently with our hands over our mouths as not to make a noise. Mr. S stopped his truck about 30 yards away and turned off his engine. It was now totally silent. I could see him from where I stood, and he had a shotgun over his shoulder as he walked towards the opposite side of the driveway, clearly looking and listening intently. In that moment, I truly thought that we were going to be found and killed. No one except for B knew where we were, and our parents were all asleep. She was a mile down the road, oblivious in her car to what was going on. I was trying desperately not to cry and sniffle in silence when I saw Mr. Escher's shadow raising his shotgun into the air and firing around. I began to feel faint, truly thinking that I was about to pass out from fear when I see car lights just up the road from the driveway. Panicking, I wondered if the lights would illuminate us in the woods and give us away, but the car seemed to slow down, and I realized that it was B. B rolled down her window and was talking loudly from her open car window, giving what I assumed were the police the address of Mr. S's house. This made him angry, and he yelled and ran towards her car for a moment, then backed away, cursing loudly and waving his gun into the air. As soon as Mr. S began driving his truck back down the driveway towards his house, we sprinted, full speed towards B's car and got in. We were crying hysterically, unable to speak, sweat pouring down each of us, and no one said a word. We just cried all the way back to T's house, showered, and I could hear sniffles and crying all throughout the night into the morning. In the end, too, no one said a word about it to T or B's parents. No one even spoke about it amongst each other for years, in fact. We never went rolling again, to say the least, but what had begun as a childish prank turned out to be one of the most horrifying experiences of my teenage years. And because we lived in the middle of nowhere and we had technically been vandalizing someone's yard, B told us about a week later that she had faked the call with 911. It's still shocking to think about, and all I can say is that we got lucky that night. Some angel somewhere was watching out for us. Looking back, B should have actually called 911, that's for sure. But we were naive kids who were more afraid of getting in trouble than realizing how at risk we were of being hurt or maybe even killed. And like I said, in the end, I think we just got lucky. Last week, I matched with a girl on Tinder. She was cute and we got along fairly well, so I decided to just go for it, and I asked her to meet up on Saturday, and to my surprise, she said yes. I suggested to just drive around town, but she insisted that I go over to her place instead. and without much thought, I agreed. I arrived around 9 p.m. This was about 20 minutes from my town. The house seemed very unkept at first, but I didn't think anything of it since there were many old houses in this area. But there was only one streetlight near her house, and I parked near it. I texted her, letting her know that I was there, and she hearted the message. I knocked a few times, but there was no answer. I tried calling again, but again there was no answer. Then I texted her that I was leaving, and I walked back to my car. Once inside, I saw messages asking where I was going and to come back, and I saw someone standing on the porch, but not from her house. It was from the house next door. They were not there before when I arrived, and the shadowy figure was not from a petite young girl. It seemed bulkier, like a man. I was freaked out by that, and so I left, but when I got back home, I saw that the profile had been completely deleted. To this day, I don't really know what to think of it. Was it just some sort of innocent prank, or was there more to it? It still gives me the creeps when I think about it. So this morning at around 5 a.m., I woke up to my boyfriend nudging me in the back, trying to wake me up. I remembered him sort of seeming panicked, but don't remember what he was saying, and we ended up just going back to sleep. We hadn't really talked about what had happened because we were at work and uni, but he just told me about it. What he said was that this morning he was woken up by me having a full-on conversation with something whilst leaning on my elbow. Apparently, I was facing the corner of the room where the closed door was. The room was completely black, and the corner was the darkest place in the room. He couldn't make out what I was saying, but he said that it was like I was speaking to something. He said that he turned around and looked at me, and I then turned over and went back to sleep. That was when he started nudging me, and he said that he woke me up because it really scared him. Now, I've never spoken in my sleep before or done anything like this. We've slept in the same bed for 2 years, and I've never done anything like this. We've slept in the same bed for 2 years, and this has never happened before. And I mean, he said a few things in his sleep before, but he's never sat up and acted like this, like he was having a conversation, but he said that I was full on looking at something and talking to it. Obviously, I have no memory of this at all, but in the past year I have experienced some sleep paralysis and saw figures standing in the doorway, so adding this to all of that, I must admit that it does scare me a bit. When I was a kid, my family moved into this old house, and some odd but harmless stuff happened there, like hearing footsteps on the hardwood floors and things like this. We always passed it off, but after we were there longer, something similar to our brother's story happened. What I mean is that when I was 13 and it had been the last day of school, I was having a sleepover one night. It was me, my oldest best friend, and 3 friends from my school. And when it was bedtime, my best friend, her name was Fran, and one of the 3 friends, her name was Sarah, slept upstairs in my bedroom, and me and the other 2 slept in the bedroom downstairs. The next morning, Fran and Sarah were wide-eyed as they asked me if I was all right, and I told them, a bit confused, that I was fine, and asked why they were asking that. And they told me that before they could fall asleep, they suddenly heard my parents yelling at me and me crying. They said it was really loud and clear, and they were sure that they heard me specifically crying on the stairs. But I assured them that that never happened. I told them that me and the other girls had gone to sleep without incident. Fran and Sarah, though, they swore up and down that they were not joking. Then, later that summer, Fran was sleeping over, as she frequently did. We were pretty much inseparable as kids, and we were part of each other's families for the most part. Anyway, we had decided to sleep in the downstairs bedroom. We were lying in bed and talking about whatever when we heard the front door open. We hear my brother Danny and my cousin Jake talking as they close the door. It was odd though, because they were both living in another state at this time. We figured, hey, they must be in town and come to visit. We hear them come in talking about raising the kitchen as they loudly went up the stairs, and to be honest, we didn't really think much of it, and we just went to sleep. The next morning, we expect to see one or both of them, but in the end, we don't. There's no car in the driveway, no suitcases, nothing. So we ask my mum where they are, and she has no idea what we're talking about. Apparently, they hadn't come, and they were, in fact, in another state. And, well, the last one that happened was I was lying in bed one night alone, and I kept hearing my dad on the phone late at night. I heard the sound of him dialing, and I hear his voice, but it's sort of muffled. It went on for a really long time, and so I crept downstairs and peeked into my parents' room, and they were fast asleep the whole time, from what I could tell. Phone wasn't even in the room. It was a landline, and it was in the 90s. I still have no idea how to explain any of this, and this is something that I keep with myself. Something that I don't think I'll ever forget. Years ago, my dad and my grandpa went hunting together in northern Canada. They were overtaken by a sudden blizzard while out in the woods, and they couldn't see anything at all, but decided to try heading back to their cabin. Somehow, they ended up walking across a frozen river, and my dad fell through the ice. My grandpa got him out, but hypothermia had set in. It was getting dark, so my grandpa dragged my dad's body through the snow, not wanting to leave his body for scavengers. At around midnight, my mum woke up suddenly with a strong feeling that she had to call her mother-in-law. Just as she reached for the phone, it rang. It was my grandma, who had also woken from a deep sleep with a strong feeling that she had to call my mum. They kept each other company throughout the night on the phone, finally laying down to sleep, each of them on their kitchen floor beside the receiver. By that point, my grandpa had given up trying to find the cabin, so he built a fire on some dead wood. Then he laid some green spruce branches on top of the coals and climbed up on them. Laying there looking out at his son's body, he thought that he saw his stomach move, and then it moved again. So he quickly grabbed my dad's seemingly frozen body and laid it on the hot spruce. Then he laid on top of him, and when morning came, they saw that they were actually only about 3 meters from the cabin, and my dad had regained consciousness. At about that time, too, both my mum and my grandma got a strong feeling that everything was all right. So they hung up their phones, and at about noon, the RCMP brought them home, and my mum, for whatever reason, was not too concerned. It's like she knew something bad had happened, but she also knew that it was going to be all right, and that was all that she needed to know. This story is still something that all of my family members still swear by. I have no idea how to explain it or what it was, but it's something that we often talk about. So to give some explanation and background knowledge for this whole encounter, I was around 15 at the time that this occurred. I was camping out in the middle of nowhere with my family and part of my extended family, my aunt, uncle and cousins. I was the oldest kid there in the RV, so you can probably understand how it felt to have no one else to do the stupid stuff that I did back then with. With a good 2-year gap between me and the inferiors, it was almost like nirvana when I got to the campground and met the other teenagers. These were all people that we knew fairly well from previous camping trips, so it was considered normal to hit it off with them from the start and act like that we'd known each other from like forever within the hour. And with that out of the way, now to the story. So my parents trusted me a lot, and not a lie as well. And while I liked my fun, I also liked getting home in time for dinner equally as much. So when I was gone most of the day with other people from the camp, they didn't think too much about it. The only rule was that I had to be back at the RV to eat dinner, and before 8:30 in the evening. So, picture this, a group of 6 teenagers, 15 to 16, out in the middle of the woods with no adult supervision for the vast majority of the day. Just a recipe for success right there, right? But this particular day, we found a neat little deer trail that we hadn't found in the 2 years that we'd been here before. On second thought, though, it didn't really seem like a deer trail, I guess. It sort of snaked through a really thick part of the underbrush, maybe a foot or 30 centimeters of clear ground, 3.5 feet or 1 meter clear of branches going upwards. It's a really hard thing to pick out from the brush unless you're either really looking or know where it is. But it was promptly explored, marked with a broken branch outside of the entrance, and quickly forgotten. Except, I remembered this little special tunnel there. That night, while we were all eating dinner, one of the adults proposed that we played manhunt out in the woods, at night. Not everyone was totally on board with this idea, but in the grand scheme of the plan, they were squashed down like autumn leaves. Everyone got a flashlight, and everyone was assigned to a team. For those of you who aren't sure what manhunt is, here's a brief explanation. So everyone playing is given a flashlight, and they're divided into 2 groups. It's basically like glorified flash tag, but there's a catch, you see. As you catch people, you have to correctly identify who they are, and if you can, they join forces with the hunters. The last man standing gets a candy bar or something, or whatever is being offered as a prize. This is how we played it. So, for the first round, I get lumped with the runners, those who are getting chased by the hunters. We get a 5-minute head start to run, climb a tree, whatever we want, to evade the hunters. Usually I'm the one up the tree, but that never really worked out as being the winning spot, so to try and score a win for once, I decided to play the cat and use one surefire method of escape. And the hiding spot was that rude little path through the thicket. It took most of the head start time to find the thing, because it was so well hidden and out of the way. As I passed hiding spots, I heard hushed, smothered whispering between siblings who were questioning my actions, like a bird's wings rustling when it's fluffing itself. It should be noted that I have bat hearing. My ears are possibly my greatest asset in the game. But when I'm just reaching the destination, I hear the short blast of the air horn announcing that the 5 minutes are up. I swan dove into this minute little path in the undergrowth, shuffling on my hands and knees until I'm about halfway in, crouching down like some huge malformed quail. The hunters are doing an initial sweep through the trails, looking for obvious hiders and people caught out trying to change spots and stuff like that. When they finally reach me, they reach the dead end and go straight back. I try to readjust myself and crawl further down the tunnel, and I honestly don't know how it happened, but I found an even more hidden path within that one. And accidentally, I dragged my stupid body down the rabbit hole. Except, instead of ending in a dead end, this one ended in a sort of slight hollow. I don't ever want to describe exactly what I found there, but I'm sorry, I just can't. But what I will say is that it was a younger looking woman, naked, covered in lacerations and wounds, in the fetal position. Her glassy glazed eyes seemed to look straight through me. I won't go any further than that, but I was too scared to scream, and I froze there while dark burgundy stains formed on my jeans. I froze there in a pseudo-catatonic position like a marble carving for what felt like hours. And then I heard someone else coming along that path. Have you ever been so scared that for one insane moment, you truly consider something incredibly stupid as a viable option to escape? That was one of those times. I let out a short, trembling whimper and started moving. Whoever was on that path, they stopped, and then eagerly started moving forward again. I could hear their panting, uneven breaths of a man, a horrible marker of whoever was getting closer and closer to me by the second. And, by some wondrous, beautiful miracle, he missed the path leading to the brushy hollow. I heard him moving down past the entrance, dragging something clunky and awkward behind him. I heard clinking noises and the occasional effort to silence the small, sharp noises. I heard a low curse, somewhere towards the end of the tunnel, and I blasted out of the undergrowth tunnel like a bullet, forcing its way out of a barrel. Cracks, crashes, and obnoxious rustling all around me as I heard the man sharply intake a breath and begin to move towards me. The hoarse, deep panting was getting closer and closer to me, a testament to how I was too slow at exiting. Somehow, I exploded out of the entrance, got onto my wobbly, half-asleep legs, and started booking it down the trail. The unknown pursuer was close behind me for a bit, but it seemed like he was too exhausted to chase me at the same speed for long. I know everyone loves to rip on the fact that people always trip in horror movies, but in all honesty, tripping is something that I am amazed I didn't do that day. With adrenaline coursing through me at the speed of Usain Bolt, trying to make my jello-like unsteady walking appendages work to move me away from whoever was behind me was like trying to run on water. It felt like an eternity, but I finally reached the main trail running back to the camp and sprinted down it screaming bloody murder. Confused faces looked out from the trees, and I think someone called after me. Reaching the camp was easy, but trying to explain why I woke up half the people in the camp and bolted out of the woods at breakneck speed was much harder. When I finally choked the words out to explain, I remember a profound, insidious silence throughout the group of adults waiting at the mouth of the trail, and I really don't remember a whole lot from that point on. I know the cops were called, and my mother and aunt ran shrieking and wailing along the trail, calling for the other kids to come back to safety. When someone's yelling like that, you don't ignore it too. They rounded everyone up in like 30 seconds flat and barreled back into the camp. The police, they found a man out in the woods, creeping along the trail clutching a knife. A black garbage bag with a plethora of sharp instruments was found, and a saw was found abandoned on the trail, some speckled and smeared with dry blood. To be honest too, I just really don't think that there's any getting over this. I still have nightmares sometimes of the man chasing me, breathing heavily down the back of my neck, trying to catch me. And sometimes in my dreams, he succeeds. So this happened a few days ago while I was on my way home from visiting my friend's house. I was driving on a back road late at night in my Tesla Model 3 while it was on auto drive. I'll admit that I was not paying attention to the road and I was on my phone while I had my music in the car playing. The ride was okay and pretty chill for a while, but I'm not really sure because I wasn't really paying attention to the time, like I said. When out of nowhere, my car immediately braked and made an alarming sound. I was pretty scared and immediately took control of the wheel and looked through the windshield. When I looked, I saw a figure standing inches from my car, barely avoiding being hit. My heart was racing from the impact and now seeing what I could only assume to be a person. They didn't even flinch though from the sight of almost being hit. I looked at them for a good 10 seconds before I put my car in park and turned on the megaphone to ask them if they're okay. They didn't respond and proceeded to walk near my window. I locked my doors while they were approaching because I was terrified. They asked me if I could roll the window down to speak to them, but I refused and told them that I could hear them from the other side. I then asked why they were out here all alone in the cold, and they told me that their car had broken down, and that they were hoping somebody would stop to help them. As they were talking, I got a good look at their face, and they appeared to be somewhere between the ages of 25 to 30. They also asked me my name, and I told them, and they said that their name was Ashton. After that initial small talk, I told them that I would be calling someone to come and assist them with their situation, and they were not happy with that, and insisted that I drop them off to a friend's house who lived nearby. That's when I became really freaked out and obviously suspicious. They had told me that they were waiting for someone, and now they needed to be dropped off. It just didn't make sense. I then put my car into drive and told them again, from the window since the megaphone is not available in park, that I would call someone to come and help them. But then, they tried to reach for the door handle, but I guess that they forgot that Tesla handles are embedded into the car. But when they did that, I immediately stepped on the pedal and went flying down the road. I didn't even look into my rearview mirror or put the car back into autopilot. The whole ride back, I was just completely terrified. I did get back onto the main road where I would hope to see cars, and I just floored it home after that. I couldn't get my mind off of it for the rest of the night though, and obviously I have my suspicions that the guy wasn't alone and that there were other people with them. I pray that they didn't get somebody else who wasn't as lucky as me, and I will never in my life stop to help some random person ever again. My family built a big farmhouse in the 1890s, and a member of our family lived there up until 2017. Everyone has some kind of a creepy story from that house. When my dad was a kid, he would see people walking past his window at night, things like that. Not really malevolent, I guess you could say, but just weird. Shortly after I was born, my mum went over to visit my dad and grandparents. My parents had me while in high school. No one was home, and Mum says really creepy things started happening. Like a door opened, she heard footsteps down the hallway. Mum got freaked out, took me, and left. Growing up, though, I loved that house, but I had almost constant nightmares about being in the master bedroom, and something trying to open the door and get to me. Never really thought much of it, to be honest. I was never at the house alone, really. But then, in 2017, 20 years after Mum got freaked out, my uncle decided that he was going to sell the house. So I went over one night to help do some work. We did some painting, cleaned out the shed, stuff like that. I slept on the couch in the living room, and when I woke up, my uncle had already left for work. I got up and went to make breakfast. While I was cooking, I remembered that I'd left my toothbrush in the car, so I went outside, got it, came back in and sat down at the table. And after I sat down, the kitchen door sort of slowly opened. I figured that it didn't latch, so I got up and closed it, and pulled on the doorknob to make sure it was closed this time. I sat back down, and then it opened again. Not fast, but faster than before. At this point, I'll admit that I was a little freaked out, but still sort of in denial, I guess. So I got up and I closed the door again, and really jerked on it to make sure it was closed this time. I sat back down, and the instant that I sat down, the door flew open. It was at this point that I started hearing footsteps from the hallway that I had nightmares about, and out of the corner of my eye, I also saw a dark shape in the living room, moving towards me. I ran out of the house and I drove off. I left my clothes, my toothbrush, my sunglasses, everything in there. I was completely terrified. The house, it sold not long after that, and I obviously never went back since then. So, I know that this is going to sound totally crazy, and I know that I'm bound to get a ton of puns and jokes from this, but has anyone else seen black-eyed children come from their closets as kids? Because when I was 5, I shared a room with my baby sister, and the closet door never closed right. As I got a little bit older, I remember seeing this little boy with black, soulless eyes come from the closet, and he would always want me to play with him. I had a decent nightlight that gave a soft glow throughout the room, and the boy never traveled into the light. I remember how, at one point, he actually got mad that I kept refusing to play with him, and he snuck around the room, grabbed the cord to the nightlight, and threw it to the ground, immediately waking my baby sister, who started screaming. I got in trouble for that because my mum always thought that I was the one who she heard playing in the room, and she was especially mad when she found the broken nightlight that night. She tried to punish me by leaving us without a nightlight, but I convinced her to at least leave the door open because I knew the boy would never be able to get to either of us if that door was open. So, we eventually moved from the house, and to this day, I never really slept in the full dark, especially with the closet door open. Up until this point, I always just wrote it off as a bad dream and thought that that was it, but my little sister, who is pregnant for the second time, said that she actually heard children giggling the other night that stopped whenever she turned on the lights and made sure all the doors throughout the house were shut. And boy, did that bring back some memories. To make things even more interesting, my boss recently admitted that there's an old superstition about not letting children sleep in a dark room with the closet door open. When I asked why, he said that there were black-eyed children who would coax the children into the closet and they would never be seen again. I don't know about that, but has anyone experienced anything like this? Is there really an urban legend of black-eyed children in closets? Why do I only hear about the black-eyed children on the streets going after adults? I need to find some answers. So this actually happened to my husband, and I was just a witness to it, so I'm going to do my best to convey his part of the story from his perspective the way that he told me. But first, I'll start with mine. So we were living in a small one-bedroom apartment in Tucson, Arizona, with my 12-year-old pitbull and our Siamese kitten, Simon. Our bedroom door was directly across the hallway from our bathroom door, and when I was laying in bed watching TV, if the bedroom door was open, I could see the bathroom door. So, while I was laying in bed watching TV, my husband was in the bathroom taking a shower. The only thing that I heard from my bed was Simon meowing and yowling like crazy outside the bathroom door, while he desperately clawed at the door. Irritated, I yelled at him until my husband came out of the bathroom, white as a sheet, holding a burnt bath towel in his hand. But even though our walls are so thin I can usually hear the water running in the bathroom, I realized that it was weirdly quiet in the bathroom from where I was sitting, which was very to the contrary of what he told me was going on in the bathroom. And not to mention that he couldn't even hear our kitty Simon losing his mind just on the other side of the door trying to get in, or me yelling at him. All my husband could hear was what he described to me as the sound of a coming train, coupled with the sound of an old lady moaning. When he pulled open the shower curtain to see what was making the strange sound, to his horror, his bath towel hanging from the towel rack on the wall was suddenly on fire. He said in the moment he was panicking about the fire and didn't consider it spontaneously ignited on its own in a steam-filled bathroom on a damp towel. He just saw it burning and jumped out of the shower and started smacking the towel to try and extinguish the flames. But as he did this, from the top down, he said the flames just sort of seemed to move down the towel, and as he put it out on the bottom, it reignited on the top and vice versa. Even stranger, the flames were mostly blue, and he said that they didn't feel hot. As soon as he finally got the fire to completely extinguish, he quickly grabbed the towel and brought it out to show me. And if I hadn't have seen it for myself, I don't know if I would have believed him. I know that he wouldn't lie to me about something like that too, but I'd be concerned about his mental health, I guess. But I did see the towel. I saw it. I touched it, and I even smelt it. It was a thick, oversized dark grey towel, and down the center, there were 2 burn marks in the shape of hockey sticks, for lack of a better descriptive word. But even though I could clearly see it had been burned, the area that it was burnt didn't feel burnt, if that makes sense, and even stranger, it didn't even smell burnt. I took a picture of the towel and then we quickly disposed of it. I don't have any idea what happened or how it happened, but I just didn't want to stay in the home that day. The picture sat on my iPhone until last year when I lost it forever when my phone went missing, but I'm still trying to find a copy of it somewhere, and if I do, I'll add it to this story. This happened in 2018, and we've had several paranormal encounters since then, but nothing compares to the self-burning towel, and it still freaks us out to this day. I mean, what the heck happened that day? When I was in 7th or 8th grade thereabouts, our school did an early summer trip where they took 10 kids who signed up, and 4 adult chaperones, to keep them wrangled, up into Frederick Sound in Alaska for 3 weeks total. The goal of the trip was kayaking to different wilderness beaches to camp and do some hiking and stuff like that. We left from Petersburg, AK, by a small seaplane, who flew us in 4s out to our first destination, which was a beautiful little bay cove and an island that you could walk to at low tide, and a smaller one that you couldn't access at all by foot. Behind the bay on the hillside was evergreen forests that they went on for what felt like forever. From there, we would be on our own for the next 2.5 weeks, by that point of the trip, that is. So, it took about half a day to get that done and the rest of the day to set up everyone's camps for the night. The first unusual thing that we saw when we arrived there was back in the tree line from the beach was old and wooden ship parts. You could find ropes and pulleys thicker than our arms, old rutted pieces of carved planks and railings, and, most interesting of all, a helm and its deck attachment. All of these things were half buried in dirt, strewn across the tree line, above the shore and in a dire state of decay. But no sign of any other part of the ship, and to this day I don't know if it had been wrecked on the shore a long time ago, or if it had been wrecked at sea and chucked up onto the beach during storms. but it was eerily fascinating to all of us kids, and brought up many wild ideas to be told at the campfire that night. After all the others went back to their tents, a girl that I had been having a thing with over the school year and I stayed by the fire to talk and flirt. Perfect night and setting for it too. We listened to some humpback whales singing out in the bay, heard some wolves in between old hoots from out in the very dark wilderness, and we had a starry night sky that looked like it was out of a dream, with a big white moon letting a bright bluish light in between the thin trees on the shore. Both of us were finally getting tired around what must have been about 1 or 2 in the morning, and we ran out of easily found wood to chuck onto the dying fire, so we headed back to our respective tents. The tents were set up in the first line of trees in a line running from the beach into the woods. The girls' 2 tents were right against the sand. The chaperones' tents was a couple of yards away from that, and us boys' 2 tents were another couple of yards from that. We were the furthest into the woods. The moonlight made it easy for me to find my way back to my tent, but once I entered the tent, I didn't see where my new friend Alex was sleeping, and I accidentally woke him up by stepping on him. Now, Alex and I had just become friends on that trip. We knew each other from some classes and in the hallways and whatnot. And while we always were friendly with each other, we definitely came from different social groups and we didn't hang out before this trip. He was an athlete and a popular kid, and I was a skater and a band kid, but we both loved the outdoors, so that in this particular moment told me neither of us were having a go at each other over what I'm about to explain, but we had no reason to prank each other, so to speak, is what I'm getting at. "Hey man, what are you doing back so late?" he asked, and I was grinning and said, I was still at the fire with Lisa." He immediately sat up and wanted to hear more. But we were quietly giggling about girls and teenage boy stuff when the woods outside just suddenly went dead silent. The kind of silence that gives you a bit of a sick feeling in your chest and throat and a weight in your stomach. And the back of my neck feels hot like a survival instinct telling you that you're not alone out there in the wild. We both noticed it too, and we also fell silent. The only sound that we could still hear besides the distant roll of waves was inside of our tent. It was our other tent mate Sam, been there the whole time and was still snoring away like a chainsaw. Funny, right? Except we were more worried as to why things had gone so silent outside. We felt uneasy about it and decided to listen for a minute. And that was when we heard it. Now, the side of our tent with the door was facing toward the other tents and the shore. This noise came from the opposite side, the wood side. I kid you not, too. It sounded like a bunch of, and I know this sounds weird, but monks meditating and harmonizing on the word Om, but without saying the M, and continued in a really prolonged drone. It moved from out of the forest coming towards our tent. It had started softly and far away and rather quickly, but steadily became louder, which is how we realized it was moving closer. It genuinely sounded human, but there was no pausing for breaths or shift in tones for any known reason. Suddenly, the noise was just right outside of the tent, and that's when we noticed even Sam had stopped snoring. He, as far as my knowledge, was still asleep, but this silence was making the noise more intense, and it circled us once. No wavering or swaying of the noise, it just circled seemingly suspended in the air, just feet away outside of our tent, at what I can only describe as a humanish height off the ground. We couldn't see through the tent, but the moon was still bright enough that we could see silhouettes of the trees outside, so I would assume if someone solid was making it, that it too would have cast a shadow from certain angles. But no visible form to this noise, no footsteps or twig snapping, just that noise circling. At this point, Alex and I's hearts were pounding in our throats, and we had looks of terror on our faces. We just kept silent and still and listened. After it made its circle around our tent, we heard it move on over to the other boys' tent and do the same. Then down to the chaperones' tent. It circled theirs, but sounded more faint due to the distance. Then it continued on to the girls' tent, where we could just barely hear it over the sound of the ocean, but sure enough, it sounded like it stayed there for a minute, based on current context, most likely circling. Then, after a few minutes, we heard it slowly return, now in a straight line from the beach and past us again back into the forest, where it just faded and eventually disappeared. A couple of minutes after the sound stopped, the nighttime forest noises returned and even Sam started snoring again. Alex and I quietly said to each other, "Did you hear that too?" And then we just tried to lay there and go back to sleep, but neither of us were very successful that night. The next morning, we went outside and checked all around the campsite, and we couldn't find any sort of tracks or anything different from the previous night. Nothing, in fact. We asked if anyone else in the group had been awake and heard anything weird, and the response was all no's. We didn't go any further into it with any of the others because we didn't want to seem weird, but Alex and I know that we experienced something really weird together. After the trip was over, he and I went back to not really hanging out, but we definitely, when we would see each other, would exchange looks of solidarity as to what happened, did really happen, and we both looked at each other differently now, because of it, I suppose. I still have no idea what that was. I know that this is a really strange and weird experience, but I'm wondering, do any of you guys have any idea as to what this could be? While taking a walk to the newsstand around the corner during the afternoon, unfortunately, my neighbor died. I swear that I was gone not even 30 minutes, too. I came back to EMTs and police swarming the building. It was kind of surreal how quickly it happened. I didn't know him super well, but I'd helped him carry in groceries, and he'd helped with my cat once, then told me in his super sassy old man way that he preferred dogs. After it happened, a bunch of residents were gathered into the common room, including the guy's roommate who had earbuds in listening to classical music, just staring into space with a blank look on his face. I assumed that he was traumatized. One of the neighbors, who's kind of a jerk, was joking about how the guy probably killed him. He started to walk over to ask him what happened, and I grabbed him, telling him not to be mean because the guy was clearly listening to classical music to calm down. We all agreed how horrific it'd be to lose a roommate and kind of scattered. The roommate was left in the common room until 11 p.m. while police waited for the body to be collected. They wouldn't let anyone back in. It's been somber since then, even though most of us didn't really know this guy. We see his roommate in the elevator and hall. He always has his headphones in. He doesn't acknowledge us, but just walks past. I've asked how he is, and he said fine. Which, okay, maybe he didn't want to talk to a total stranger, right? A few of the rest of us have chatted about the neighbor who passed and fun memories and stuff like that, but then yesterday I heard building staff talking about when they found him. Apparently, he was in nothing but a diaper. He was old, like I said, but he was laying on his sideways across the bed with his head almost to the floor, and his roommate was sitting calmly within sight at a table about 10 feet away. When the worker rushed to do CPR, she asked how long he'd been like that, and the roommate replied, "Oh, him? About 20 minutes. Now, it seems like it was natural causes, but the entire thing is obviously really bizarre upon hearing that. Several people also saw him shortly before this, fully clothed, and his roommate was just sitting there in the apartment with him while he died? I don't know. It's creepy, man, and I'm really glad that I'm moving out soon." So I work in a retirement home, and my job often requires me to go into the basement with a cart full of dirty laundry. That means that I have to use the elevator a lot. I've done this 1,000 times already, and never, ever did I hear or see anything unusual. Now, since I work in a retirement home, amongst a lot of other rooms in the basement, there is also a temporary morgue which is located opposite of the elevator entrance. This morgue was probably used at some point in time, but as long as I've ever been working there, it has never been unlocked. Nobody used that room for anything. Today, I was working as normal, going about my day, not feeling creeped out at all since it was the middle of the day, and I've been to this basement too many times already and never had the reason to be scared of it. I went down to the basement, emptied the dirty laundry in the laundry room, and called the elevator down again since somebody had to use it. I pressed the button, but the elevator wasn't coming down. Above me, through the closed elevator doors, I could hear two of my co-workers speaking and holding the elevator from closing. The space in the elevator is very acoustic, and you can easily hear people on it from the basement all the way up to the third floor. At this point, I was getting a little bit annoyed because it was a particularly busy day and I didn't have any time to spare, so I started knocking on the elevator doors to let them know that I was waiting for it. After a few knocks, it didn't seem to me that they didn't register it as someone knocking for them to get off the elevator, so I decided to knock in a little sort of melody or rhythm to get their attention. And this is where something very weird happened. Maybe 5 seconds after that knock, I started hearing knocking back. It didn't have any particular pattern, and it sounded like literal knocking on a door. I first thought that it was coming from my co-workers above, but quickly realized that it was coming from behind me. I turned around to find the basement completely empty, and I couldn't quite figure out at first where it was coming from. That is, until I came a few feet closer to the sound. It was coming from the morgue. I froze. 1,000 thoughts came rushing through my mind as I tried to somehow rationalize what I was hearing. I wanted to leave the cart behind and just sprint up the stairs to get out of there when I heard the elevator finally coming down. It was the longest wait ever, but I finally got on and pressed the button to the third floor. I must have pressed it 20 times before the door closed too and got me out of there. Now, maybe all of this can be very easily explained away with it being an older building, sounds from the pipes or animals or something like that, and being a pure coincidence with my knocking, but I never heard the building ever make a knocking sound on the door like that before, and it definitely sounded more than just an animal. Needless to say, though, whatever it was, it really creeped me out. Admittedly, I was a foolish and immature teenage girl when I graduated high school 23 years ago. While others were focused on securing military futures and or furthering their education, I was really only looking forward to moving out of my parents' home and moving in with my high school sweetheart. It would end up being a huge mistake that I regret to this day, but I digress. For the sake of anonymity, we'll call him Jack. Though we lived in different towns and attended different schools, Jack and I had been dating a few years prior to graduation. When we weren't in school, we were pretty much inseparable, so it was no surprise to anyone when we started looking for a place to rent and move in together. What did come as a surprise, however, was Jack's suggestion to share a place with two of his friends so that we could all split the bills. It wasn't quite what I had in mind, but I was familiar with both of them and eventually, against my better judgment, agreed to having roommates. The four of us soon moved into the upstairs apartment of an old 2-story house in a seedy neighborhood. Of course, it wasn't long before everything hit the fan, as neither of the roommates consistently paid their share of the rent, and the place was overrun by people who didn't even live there. The constant drug use, fighting, property damage, kicking out random people sleeping on the couch, etc. It was pure chaos, and I was just an outcast living somewhere I clearly didn't belong. But the worst part of it all for me was that Jack and I had grown apart. It was honestly as if I never even really knew Jack at all. Living in a house full of potheads and drug addicts for several months made me hate drugs too, and even weed to be honest. Yet I continued to smoke it myself in an attempt to find semblance of peace and happiness. My own friends would visit often, which also helped me to cope with all the stuff that I was living through to some extent. But still, any time that I had a reason to get out of that house, I did, and so was the case on Halloween night of that year. My friend, Steph, had stopped by to hang out, and we both smoked for a bit before getting the munchies and realizing that it was Halloween. Being that there was never any food in the house, because someone would always steal it, we quickly recognized the solution to our problem and set out on foot to relive our youth and score some free chocolate bars. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Yes, we were too old for trick-or-treating. Yes, we should have been ashamed of ourselves for taking candy that was meant for little kids. Yes, we were selfish and immature. And no, we didn't care. We were just hungry. The timing was perfect, though, as people had just started filing down the streets with kids in goofy costumes, racing from door to door. Steph and I weren't wearing costumes because, well, we were bums. And that's the answer that we gave every time that we knocked on a door and they asked. I'm sure that the ones who didn't question us had already figured that out when they saw these 2 wrinkled Walmart bags that we held open for candy. But having satisfied our munchies while eating candy along our little adventure, we decided to keep walking and knocking as long as we could to increase our future candy stash. It wasn't until streets were silent and empty, with nearly every porch light turned off, before we finally called it quits and began our long trek back to the apartment in the dark. The mood, though, it soon changed on the walk back. You see, up to that point, it had been a fun and memorable night, but for some reason, neither of us could shake this awful feeling of impending doom, as if we were about to star in our own real-life horror movie. From a rational perspective, this fear was simply due to walking in the dark on Halloween and smoking a bit, but the fact that we never told anyone where we were going or what we were doing stuck in our minds. We weren't even sure if anyone knew that we left the apartments, to be honest. Not that any of them would have really cared, but the mere thought of nobody having a shred of information to share if we went missing somehow was suddenly quite unsettling. Anyway, the night air grew colder by the time that we finally found ourselves speeding down the hilly block of houses that led to my apartment, and we were both glad to see that the porch light in front of my door was still on. We slowed our pace toward the bottom of the hill, and as we crossed the street toward the sidewalk, our fears soon became a reality. From behind a vehicle parked in our neighbor's driveway, a very tall man quietly stepped out of the darkness. As silly as it sounds, he was wearing what appeared to be a large hairy werewolf mask draped over his entire head, paired with Freddy Krueger gloves on his hands. He stared intently, gently tapping the long, spiky claws of one glove against his chest as he rounded the bumper of the vehicle before slowly moving toward us with each step. It was actually quite terrifying at first, but I quickly assumed that it must have been someone that we knew from the apartment trying to scare us. So, brave little me started laughing and mocking this stupid outfit. But what the man did next sent chills to my core. Still silent, he stopped moving, sort of cocked his head to one side, and lowered his hand from his chest. Then, he suddenly started speed-walking right toward us. A second wave of fear coursed through my veins as Steph and I instantly bolted across the sidewalk toward the front door. Steph made it through the threshold first, and I leapt inside soon after, quickly turning to slam the door and lock it. I saw the wolf mask facing me immediately behind the door as I did so too, and just as I locked the deadbolt, he tried turning the handle from the other side of the door to get in. We were merely a split second away from, well, whatever that was. Steph and I collapsed on the floor trying to catch our breath as we heard him scratching at the door with his claws. Someone eventually looked down the stairwell to see what the commotion was about, but by that time, the scratching had ceased. As we made our way upstairs to see who was and who wasn't in the apartment, I was shocked to see a room full of people that included both of the guys that I suspected of pulling the prank, as they were a similar height and build to the man outside. One of the guys did go outside to see who might be trying to get in, but the man was long gone. Everyone in the apartment denied having anything to do with it, and to be honest, everyone was accounted for there, so it really didn't seem like it was them. The only other possibility that crossed my mind was the guy who lived below us with his wife and baby on the first floor, but when I later asked his wife about it, she told me that it couldn't have been him because they were all inside that night, and they didn't have any company either. Steph and I, we never did learn the true identity of the Wolfman, and I guess we'll never know what his true intentions were that night, but, I mean, perhaps it was all just a well-orchestrated prank by someone that we knew, right? Or maybe it was simply a prank by a random stranger. I prefer to think of it as a prank either way, because regardless of who was behind the mask, the thought of this being anything other than a prank is, quite honestly, very disturbing. As for Jack, our relationship finally ended when I left him. After I moved out, he kicked his friends out of the apartment for not paying rent, and he was stuck cleaning up the mess that they left behind too. It was a great time to man up for Jack, I suppose, but anyway, to anyone who made it this far, I guess the lesson here is trust your instincts. Stay smart, stay safe, and stay sane out there, especially this Halloween. This happened years ago in the 80s when I was 19. I live in a small town in the south, and it was common to have bonfires in the woods on the weekends in the fall. My friend and I, both female, went to a spot where a few others were hanging out in an open area in the woods. There was a fire, and we were all standing around drinking wine coolers and beer, just talking and hanging out. The main subject being a friend of ours who went missing a few days earlier. He was the kind of guy everyone knew, but I wasn't close friends with him or anything. My friend is talking to someone though, and a guy comes over to me and starts making small talk. He seemed a little bit weird, and I only knew him as the guy who dated a girl that I went to grade school with. I couldn't quite understand why, but I felt a chill and an eerie feeling while he was talking with me. So much so, in fact, that I walked away in the middle of his conversation and grabbed my friend and told her that we needed to leave now. She seemed a bit confused, but could tell by my tone that something was wrong. When we got to the car, I told her that I couldn't explain it, but I just felt really uneasy, so we left and we didn't think much else about it. Well, a couple of days later, the guy's body was found, the guy that was missing, in a shallow grave in the woods, and it was soon discovered that he was murdered over a dispute about a girl by none other than the weird guy making small talk with me at the fire. I still get creeped out thinking about just how casually he was just out in the woods, hanging out, knowing that he murdered a guy and that everyone was discussing the missing friend in front of him. A twist to the story too is that a few years later, he escaped prison and was on the run for about a week. I worked at a movie store at the time, and one day a woman came in to rent a VCR and movies. She was on some kind of drugs and very obviously high. She was all over the place and her eyes were wide and she was talking non-stop. And then she proceeded to tell me that she was staying at a cabin at the lake with the escaped murderer that I just told you about. I acted normal and began filing out the info for her to rent and told her that I had to get something from the back. I called the law and I told them what she said, and they ended up following her and catching the guy again. There were lots of creepy encounters growing up in the 80s. I loved growing up then, but definitely had a lot of close calls and weird encounters when I was younger. And this one is one that I'll never forget.